The Wench Is Dead by Colin Dexter. Read by Kevin Waitley. Intermittently on the Tuesday, he felt sick. Frequently on the Wednesday, he was sick. On the Thursday, he felt sick frequently, but was actually sick only intermittently. Early on the Friday morning, drained, listless, and infinitely weary, he found the energy to drag himself from his bed to the telephone and to apologise to his superiors at Kidlington Police HQ for what was going to be a non-appearance that late November day. On the Saturday morning, as he sat in the kitchen of his bachelor flat scanning the Times, dressed in pyjamas as gaudily striped as a Lido deck chair, he was aware that prickles of sweat were forming on his forehead. Afterwards, Morse thought he remembered passing a hand over a forehead that now felt very wet and very, very cold, and then taking 2 or 3 hugely deep breaths, and then starting to rush for the bathroom. It was Mrs. Green, the charlady, who came in Saturday mornings, who rang 999 immediately and demanded an ambulance. She'd found her employer sitting with his back to the wall in the entrance hall, conscious, seemingly sober, and passably presentable, except for the deep maroon stains down the front of his deck chair pyjamas. At 10:15, Morse, with an itchy grey blanket draped around a clean pair of pyjamas, vomited copiously and noisily into a white enamel kidney bowl, while the ambulance turned into the grounds of the John Radcliffe Hospital and stopped outside the Accident, Casualty and Emergency Department. The kidney bowl had been left within easy reach, and Morse, on a hospital trolley now, was retching violently if unproductively when a young houseman came to stand beside him. "You've got a bit of nasty tummy trouble." Morse shrugged vaguely. "I'm all right, really." "You're not all right, I'm afraid. At best you've got a stomach ulcer. That's suddenly decided to burst out bleeding. At worst, you've got a perforated ulcer." For the next few minutes, the doctor prodded, squeezed, and kneaded the paunchy flesh around Morse's abdomen. "Could lose a couple of stone, your liver's enlarged." "I thought you said it was the stomach." "Oh, it is. You've had a stomach hemorrhage." "What's that got to do with my liver?" "Do you drink a lot, Mr. Morse?" "Well, I like a glass of beer, yes." "How many pints do you drink a week?" "A week? Well, a day, then." Morse divided by 3. 2 or 3, I suppose. "Do you drink spirits?" "Occasionally." "What spirits?" Morse shrugged. "Scotch, sometimes." "How long would a bottle last you?" "It depends how big it was." But Morse immediately saw that his humour was ill-appreciated, and he swiftly multiplied by 3. "Week, 10 days. About that." "How many cigarettes do you smoke a day?" 8, 10. Morse was getting the hang of things now, and smoothly dividing by 3. "Do you ever take any exercise? Walking, jogging, cycling, squash?" But Morse had reached for the kidney bowl, and as he vomited, the houseman observed with some alarm the brightly crimsoned specks of blood. For some while afterwards, Morse's mind was somewhat hazy. Later, however, he knew that the angel of death had fluttered its wings above his head, and he felt a sudden frisson of fear, as for the first time in his life he began to think about dying. When Morse awoke the following morning, he was aware of a grey dawn through the window of the small ward, and of a clock on the wall showing 4:50 a.m. The tubing strapped to his right wrist, and stretching up to a saline drip bottle hooked above his bed, was dragging uncomfortably against his skin. The awkward apparatus rendered him immobile, of course, at least until he had mastered the skills of the young man from the adjacent bed, who had spent most of the previous evening wandering freely, holding his own drip high above his head like some Ethiopian athlete brandishing the Olympic torch. Through the archway to his right, he could see a slimly attractive nurse talking earnestly to a fresh-faced young houseman, and soon the two of them were walking quietly, unfussily into the ward, then disappearing behind the drawn curtains of the bed diagonally opposite Morse's. When he'd first been wheeled in, Morse had noticed the man who occupied that bed, a proud-looking man, late 70s perhaps, with an Indian Army moustache and a thin thatch of pure white hair. For a second or two, the old warrior's watery pale eyes had settled on Morse's face, but the rampant septicemia, which had sent a bright pink suffusion to his waxen cheeks, had taken from him all power of speech. It was 5:20 when the houseman emerged from behind the curtains, 5:30 when the porters wheeled the dead man away, and when exactly half an hour later the full lights flickered on in the ward, The curtain round the bed of the late Colonel Wilfred Denniston, OBE, MC, was standing open, to reveal newly laundered sheets, with the changed blankets professionally mitred at the foot. At 6:45, Morse was aware of voices, the clinking of crockery, the squeaking of ill-oiled wheels, and finally Violet, a considerably overweight West Indian woman, hove into view, pushing a tea trolley. And how Morse welcomed it. For the first time in the past few days, he was conscious of a positive appetite for food and drink. Already he had surveyed with envy the jugs of water and bottles of squash that stood on the bedside tables of his fellow patients, though for some reason not of the man immediately opposite, one Walter Greenaway, above whose bed there hung a rectangular plaque bearing the sad little legend, "Nil by mouth." "Tea or coffee, Mr. Greenaway?" "Just a large gin and tonic." "Ice and lemon?" "No ice, thanks. Spoils the gin." Violet moved away massively to the next bed. Mr. Greenaway winked across at Morse. "All right, Chief?" "On the mend." "That's exactly what the old Colonel used to say, on the mend, poor old boy." "I see," said Morse, with some unease. "No tea for you, then?" Greenaway shook his head. "They're operating on me at 10. That's why I'm not allowed to drink." Violet had effected a U-turn by now, and was at last beside Morse's bed. "Morning." "Good morning. Coffee, please. 2 sugars." My, 2 sugars." Violet turned to share the private joke with the grinning Greenaway. Then she wagged a brown forefinger at a point somewhere above his bed, and by twisting his neck, Morse could see, behind his saline apparatus, a rectangular plaque bearing the sad little legend, "Nil by mouth." Detective Sergeant Lewis came into the ward just after 7 that Sunday evening, clutching a Sainsbury carrier bag with the air of a slightly guilty man walking through the customs shed. "Well," he said, "what do they say is the trouble?" "Trouble? No trouble. It's just a case of mistaken identity." Lewis grinned. "Seriously, though?" "Seriously? Well, they put me on some big white pills that cost a couple of quid a time, so the nurses say. Do you realise you can get a very decent little bottle of claret for that?" "What about the food?" "What food? They haven't given me a thing. No drink either." Lewis's eyes jerked downwards towards the carrier bag. "Come on, Lewis. What have you got in there?" Lewis reached inside the bag and brought out a bottle of lemon barley water. "The missus thought, well, you wouldn't be allowed to drink anything else much." "Very kind of her." "And here's a book." It was entitled Scales of Injustice, a comparative study of crime and its punishment in the county of Shropshire, 1842 to 1852. Morse took the thick volume and surveyed it without obvious enthusiasm. Looks fairly interesting." "You don't mean that, do you, sir?" "No. It's a sort of family heirloom, and the missus just thought, tell that wonderful missus of yours I'm very pleased with it. Perhaps you'll do me a favour and leave it in the hospital library when you come out." Morse laughed quietly, and he was still smiling when an extraordinarily pretty young nurse, with a freckled face and mahogany-highlighted hair, came to the bedside and waved an admonitory finger at the lemon barley bottle which Morse had placed on his locker top. "Who's that?" whispered Lewis when she had passed on her way. "That, Lewis, is the fair Fiona. I sometimes wonder how the doctors manage to keep their dirty hands off her. Perhaps they don't. I thought you'd come to cheer me up." But for the moment good cheer seemed in short supply. The ward's sister had clearly been keeping her dragon's eyes on events in general, and in particular on events around the bed where the dehydrated chief inspector lay. With purposeful stride, she took the few steps from her vantage point behind the main desk. Her left hand grasped the offending bottle, while her eyes fixed unblinkingly upon the luckless Lewis. "We have our regulations in this hospital. A copy is posted just outside the ward. If you intend to visit again, I'll be glad if you'd report to whoever's in charge. Your friend here's quite poorly. We're all trying our very best to see that he gets well again quickly. We can't do that if you bring in all the wrong things, OK?" Lewis looked wretchedly uncomfortable as this grimly visaged, tight-lipped sister, a silver buckle clasped around her dark blue uniform, turned away and was gone. Even Morse appeared strangely cowed and silent. "Who's that?" "You have just encountered the embittered soul of our sister Maclean, devoted to an ideal of humourless efficiency, sort of Calvinistic Thatcherite. Doesn't have to be so sharp, does she? She's probably disappointed in her love life. They call her Nessie. Was she born near the lock? In it, Lewis. The two men laughed a little, yet the incident had been unpleasant. For 5 minutes, Lewis quizzed Morse quietly about the other patients, and Morse told him of the dawn departure of the ex-Indian Army man. But nothing could quite efface the fact that that bloody sister, as Morse referred to her, had cast a shadow over the visit. "Well," said Lewis finally, "I'd better be off, sir." "What else have you got in that bag?" "Nothing." "Lewis, my stomach may be out of order, but there's nothing wrong with my bloody ears." Slowly, Lewis withdrew a small, flattish bottle wrapped in tissue paper. "But not until it's official-like," he hissed, palming the gift surreptitiously beneath the bedclothes. "Bells?" Lewis nodded. It was a happy moment. As Lewis rose to leave, he dipped his hand once more into the carrier bag and produced his final offering, a paperback entitled The Blue Ticket, with a provocative picture of an economically clad nymphette on the cover. "Thought you might enjoy something a little bit lighter, sir." "Well, the title's a bit shorter than the other thing." And the two friends shared a happy grin. Half an hour after Lewis's departure, Fiona came again to Morse's bedside and asked him to unfasten his pyjama bottoms, to turn over, and to expose his right buttock. Which orders having been obeyed, the unsmiling Nessie was summoned to insert a syringe of colourless liquid into his flank. Morse heard himself grunt, "Christ!" when what felt like a bar of iron was implanted in his backside. "You'll feel a wee bit sleepy," said the Loch Ness Monster, and Fiona was left to pour some disinfectant onto a piece of gauze, which she proceeded to rub vigorously around the punctured area. "She'd have landed a top job in Buchenwald, that woman," said Morse. But from the uncomprehending look on her face, he suddenly realised that Nazi concentration camps were as far back in the young nurse's past as the relief of Mafeking was in his own, and he felt his age. "What I mean is—" Fiona smiled down at him, as Morse's eyelids drooped heavily over his tired eyes. Nessie had said he'd feel a wee bit weary. His head jerked down against his chest. Morse felt a soft-fingered hand on his right wrist, and opened his eyes to find himself staring up into the face of a very small woman, some 75 to 80 summers, wispily white-haired, her face deeply wrinkled. She wore an old-fashioned NHS hearing aid in her left ear. Its cord stretched down to a batteried appliance in the pocket of a dirty, loose, grey woolen cardigan. Who was she? Who'd let her in? It was 9:45 p.m. by the ward clock, and 2 night nurses were on duty. "Mr. Horse? Mr. Horse, is it?" Her eyes squinted myopically at his elastoplast name tag. "Do you know, I think they've spelt your name wrong, Mr. Horse. It's Morse. M-O-R-S-E. "Yes, but it was expected, you know. They'd already told me that Wilfred had only a few days left to live. 52 years we'd been together." Belatedly, Morse realised who she was. "He liked being here, you know. He was so grateful to you all. He wanted me to thank all of you, all his old friends here." "He was a fine man," began Morse a little desperately. "I wish I'd got to know him." The hearing aid began to whistle shrilly, and the old lady fiddled ineffectually with the earpiece. "And that's why I've got this little book for you. He was so proud of it. It took him a very long time, and it was a very happy day for him when it was printed." She handed him a little booklet in bottle-green paper covers. "And you will promise to read it, won't you?" "Oh, yes, certainly." The old lady fingered her whistling aid once more, smiled with the helplessness of a stranded angel, and said, "Goodbye, Mr. Horse," and moved on to the adjacent bed. Morse looked down vaguely at the slim volume. It could contain no more than, some 20-odd pages? He would look at it later. Tomorrow, perhaps. For the moment, he could think of nothing but closing his weary eyes once more, and he placed Murder on the Oxford Canal by Wilfred M. Denniston inside his locker. Tomorrow. Yes. The endoscopy, performed the following morning, persuaded the surgeons that in Morse's case the knife was probably not needed. Their prognosis, too, was modestly encouraging, provided the patient could settle into a more cautiously sober regimen for the months and years ahead. Furthermore, as a token of their muted optimism, the patient was that evening to be allowed 1/2 bowl of oxtail soup, and a portion of vanilla ice cream. Lewis reported to Sister McLean at 7:30 p.m, was unsmilingly nodded through, and for 10 minutes or so the two men talked of this and that, with Lewis receiving the firm impression that his chief was recovering rapidly. Fiona the Fair put in a brief appearance towards the end of the visit, shaking out Morse's pillows and placing a jug of cold water on his locker. "Lovely girl," Lewis said. "You're married, remember?" "Done any reading yet?" the missus was wondering. "I'm halfway through it, tell her. Riveting stuff." "You're not serious." Suddenly there, beside the bed, was Sister McLean. "Who brought the jug of water?" "It's all right, Sister," Morse began. "The doctor said—" "Nurse Welsh!" Lewis stared at the floor in embarrassment as student nurse Welsh walked warily over to Morse's bed, to be firmly admonished by her superior. Free access to liquids was to be available only WEF the following dawn and not before. Had the student nurse not read the notes before going the rounds with her water jugs? And if she had, did she not realise that no hospital could function satisfactorily with such sloppiness? Another sickening little episode. And a few minutes later Lewis bade his chief farewell. There was virtually no one around in the ward now. Only a woman of about 30, slimly attractive and blonde-headed, Walter Greenaway's daughter, Morse guessed, still sat beside her father. Feeling minimally guilty that he'd not yet so much as opened the cover of the precious work that Mrs. Lewis had vouchsafed to his keeping, Morse reached for the book from his locker and skimmed through its first paragraph. Conflicting strategic choices within heterogeneous areas, starkly differentiated creeds, greater knowledge of variable economic performances, as well as physical, physiological, or physiognomical peculiarities, can suggest possible avenues never exhaustively explored by any previous student of criminal behaviour in 19th century Britain. "Christ," muttered Morse. A few years ago he might possibly have considered persevering with such incomprehensible twaddle, but no longer. He closed the work smartly. There was a rather more attractive proposition waiting in his locker, the pornographic paperback which Lewis had smuggled in. A yellow flash across the glossy cover made its promise to the reader of scorching lust and primitive sensuality. Morse opened the book and skimmed a second paragraph that evening. She surfaced from the pool and began to unbutton her clinging, sodden blouse, and as she did so the young men all fell silent, their eyes now riveted to the carmine tips of her slimly sinuous fingers as they slipped inside her blouse and so slowly, so tantalizingly flicked open a further button. "Christ!" Morse leaned back against his pillows with a satisfied smile about his lips, clasping to himself the prospect of a couple of hours of delicious titillation on the morrow. Then he replaced the blue ticket in his locker, on top of scales of injustice, and the hitherto neglected Murder on the Oxford Canal. At 2 a.m, the inevitable occurred. But fortunately Morse managed to attract the attention of charge nurse Eileen Stanton as she flitted nightingale-like around the darkened wards. "I don't know which way up the thing should go," Morse said. "Which way round, you mean?" Eileen whispered. And then she proceeded to explain exactly how the well-trained patient should negotiate this particular crisis. Then, leaving him with a half-roll of white toilet paper and the assurance of a second coming within 10 minutes, she was gone. It was all over, consummated with a bowl of warm water and a brief squirt of some odoriferous air freshener. Phew! Not half as bad as Morse had feared, thanks to that ethereal girl. His imagination followed the slender Eileen as elegantly she walked away, about 5'8" in height, mid-20s, a delicately featured, high-cheekboned face. No ring on either hand. She looked so good, so wholesome in her white uniform. Go to sleep, Morse. At 7:30 a.m, after breakfasting on a single wafer of Weetabix, with an inadequate pour-over of semi-skimmed milk and no sugar, Morse noted with great satisfaction that the nil-by-mouth embargo was now in abeyance, and he poured himself a glass of water with the joy of a liberated hostage. He began to feel more happily settled, and after 20 minutes with the Times, letters read, crossword completed, he folded back the covers of the blue ticket, and moving comfortably down against his pillows, started Chapter 1. "Good book?" "So-so." Morse had not been aware of Fiona's presence. "Detective story?" Morse nodded uneasily. "Sit up." Morse leaned forward as she softened up his pillows and went on her way. "Lovely girl, isn't she?" said Greenaway, now much recovered, and himself reading a book whose title was plain for all to see, The Age of Steam. Morse pushed his own novel as unobtrusively as possible into his locker. "That's the blue ticket." "Pardon? You've got the blue ticket?" "Ah, yes, I don't know why I'm bothering to read it, really. Same reason I did, I suppose, hoping for a bit of sex." Morse grinned defeatedly. "It's a bit of a let-down," Greenaway went on. "My daughter sometimes brings me one or two books like that." "She was the woman last night?" The other nodded. "She's in library work at the Bodley." After what seemed to him a wretchedly insubstantial lunch, Morse was scheduled that afternoon to visit various investigative departments. He returned to the ward weary, impatient, and thirsty. With the eyes of Greenaway upon him, he decided that the sexual fantasies of the blue ticket might have to be postponed a while. He wouldn't be seeing Lewis that evening, but at 7:05 he managed to sort out his headphones for the Archers, and at 7:20 he decided to dip into the late Colonel's magnum opus. By 7:30 he was engrossed. "Murder on the Oxford Canal," he read. "Copyright 1978 by Wilfred Denniston, OBE, MC. The author wishes to acknowledge the help he has received from the Bodleian Library and from the court registers of the Oxford Assizes, 1859 and 1860. Further details of the trials mentioned may be found in the editions of Jackson's Oxford Journal for the 20th and 27th of August, 1859, and for the 15th and 22nd of April, 1860. Part 1. A Profligate Crew. Those who explore the back streets and byways of our great cities, or indeed our small cities, will sometimes stumble upon sad memorials, untended, silent, forgotten, hidden in neglected churchyards. Such a churchyard was to be found until recent years at the lower end of the pretty little road in North Oxford, now designated Middle Way. But in the early 1960s, most of the tombstones in the Summertown parish churchyard were removed from their original supracorporeal sites. The few headstones which are today to be found are but 1/10 or so of the memorials once erected there. And one of these headstones, a moss-greened limestone slab, bears the epitaph, "To the memory of Joanna Franks, wife of Charles Franks of London, who, having been primitively and cruelly assaulted, was found most tragically drowned in the Oxford Canal on June the 22nd, 1859, aged 38 years. Requiescat in pace aeterna." Beyond this poignant epitaph, there lies a tale of unbridled lust and drunken lechery, a tale of a hapless and helpless young woman who found herself at the mercy of coarse and brutal boatmen, during an horrendous journey made nearly 120 years ago. Joanna Franks hailed originally from Derby. Her father, Daniel Carrick, an agent of the Nottinghamshire and Midlands Friendly Society, appears to have maintained a reasonably prosperous position in his community. However, in the few years prior to the tragic death of his only daughter, there was a younger brother, Daniel, he encountered a period of hard times. Joanna's first husband was F.T. Donovan from County Meath. A man of large physique, he was known by the nickname of Hefty Donovan. A conjurer by profession, he appeared in theatres and music halls both in London and in the provinces. The following theatre handbill was printed at his own expense to herald his appearance at the Nottingham Music Hall in September 1856. "Mr. Donovan, citizen of the world and of Ireland, unrivalled in magic and deception, has had conferred upon him the unchallenged title of Emperor of all Illusionists, by virtue of the amazing trick of cutting off a cockerel's head and then restoring the bird to its pristine animation. This same Donovan, the greatest man in the world, last week diverted his great audience in Croydon by immersing his whole body tightly chained in a tank of the most corrosive acid for 11 minutes and 45 seconds, as measured by scientific chronometer." But the great man's career was beginning to prove unsuccessful, and no stage appearances whatsoever are traceable in 1858. In that year he died, a childless and embittered man, in Ireland, where his grave now rests in a burial plot overlooking Burtnaboy Bay. Some time afterwards, his widow Joanna met and fell deeply in love with one Charles Franks, an ostler from Liverpool. Joanna's second marriage appears to have been a happy one. in spite of the fact that times were hard and money scarce. The new Mrs. Franks was able to find employment as a dressmaker in Liverpool. But Franks himself was less successful and finally decided to try his luck in London. Here he was engaged as an ostler at the George and Dragon Inn on the Edgware Road. In late May of 1859, he sent his wife a guinea, all he could afford, and begged her to join him in London as soon as possible. So, in June 1859, Joanna Franks, carrying 2 small boxes, made her way by barge from Liverpool to Preston Brook, the northern terminus of the Trent and Mersey Canal. Here she joined one of Pickford & Co.'s express, or fly, boats, which was departing for Stoke-on-Trent, and thence via the Coventry and Oxford canals through to London on the main Thames waterway. A fly boat, Morse learned from a footnote here, travels round the clock, with a double crew working shifts, with horses exchanged at regular intervals along the canals. The fare of 16 shillings and 11 pence, the narrative continued, was considerably cheaper than the fare on the Liverpool-London railway line. Joanna was an extremely petite and attractive figure, wearing a blue dress with a white kerchief and a figured silk bonnet. The clothes may not have been new, but they gave Joanna a very tidy appearance. A very tempting appearance, too, as we shall soon discover. The captain of the narrowboat, Barbara Bray, was a certain Jack Rory Oldfield from Coventry. According to the later testimony of fellow boat people, he was a good-natured sort of fellow, of a blunt, blustery type of address. He was married, though childless, and was aged 42 years. The fellow members of his crew were the 30-year-old Alfred Musson, alias Alfred Brotherton, Walter Towns, alias Walter Thorold, the 26-year-old illiterate son of a farm labourer, and a teenaged lad, Thomas Wootton, from Ilkeston in Derbyshire. The Barbara Bray left Preston Brook at 7:30 on Saturday the 11th of June. At the southern end of the Mersey Canal, she negotiated the locks, and on Sunday the 19th of June slipped quietly into the northern reaches of the Coventry Canal, and settled to a course due south towards Oxford. Progress had been surprisingly good, and there had been no forewarning of the tragic events which lay ahead for the Barbara Bray, and for her solitary paying passenger, Joanna Franks, for whom such a little span of life remained. After reading these few pages, Morse found himself making some mental queries about a few minor items, and harbouring some vague unease about 1 or 2 major ones. He wrote a few notes on the back of a hospital menu which had been left on his locker. Burtnaboy Bay, he wrote. His knowledge of geography was minimal. Where was Burtnaboy Bay? And this Irish conjurer, old Donovan, must certainly have had something about him, but the greatest man in the world might be going over the top a bit. And the Colonel's style was somewhat on the pretentious side, a bit too high-flown for Morse's taste. Yet the writing was a good deal above the average of its kind, and calculated to ensure some page-turning to Part 2. It was paradoxical, perhaps, that Morse should suddenly find himself so fascinated by the Oxford Canal. He was aware that many people were besotted with boat life, but in Morse's extremely limited experience, narrow boating was a grossly overrated activity. Once, on the invitation of a pleasant enough couple, he'd agreed to be piloted up to the Plough at Wolvercote, a journey of only a couple of miles, which would be accomplished, he was assured, within the hour. In fact, it had been so fraught with misfortunes that the finishing line was finally reached with only 5 minutes drinking time remaining, and that on a hot and thirsty Sunday noon. That particular boat had required a couple of people, one to steer and one to keep hopping out for the locks, and Joanna's boat had got 4 of them on it. 5 with her, so it must have been awfully crowded on that long and tedious journey, pulled slowly by some unenthusiastic horse, and the fare she'd paid, 16 shillings and 11 pence in 1859, seemed somewhat on the steep side. What would the rail fare have been? Morse had no idea. And what was it like to live on such boats? Boats crewed by men from all over the place. And why on earth all these aliases? Were the crewmen counted a load of crooks before they ever came to court? Did everyone on the canal have 2 names? A by-name, as it were, as well as one written in the christening book? Surely any jury was bound to feel a prejudice against such, even before. Morse was feeling tired, and already his head had jerked up twice after edging by degrees towards his chest. Charge nurse Eileen Stanton came on duty at 9, and Morse was sound asleep when she went quietly to his bedside and gently took the hospital menu from his hand and placed it on his locker. When the following morning Fiona came to remove the saline drip permanently, Morse knew that the gods were smiling. When, further, he walked down the corridor to the washroom without attendant, he felt like Florestan newly released from confinement in Act 2 of Fidelio. Back in the ward, he was visited by one of the ten-a-penny dietitians in the place, a plain-looking, serious-souled young madam who took him through a host of low-calorie vegetables, on which he could fill up ad libitum. Asparagus, bamboo shoots, beans broad, beans French, beans runner, bean sprouts, broccoli, celery, chicory, chives, courgettes. And that was only the first 3 letters. Dutifully Morse nodded at suitable intervals, knowing deep down that he could, should, and bloody well would shed a couple of stone fairly soon. In the early afternoon, after listening to the repeat of the Archers, Morse knew exactly what he wanted next. He wouldn't have given 2 Madagascan monkeys for a further couple of chapters of the Blue Ticket. He turned to Murder on the Oxford Canal. Part 2, A Proven Crime. Although at the time there were a few conflicting statements about individual circumstances in the sequence of events, the general pattern as presented here is, and indeed always has been, undisputed. The 38-mile stretch of the Coventry Canal appears to have been negotiated without any untoward incident. The Barbara Bray reached Hawkesbury Junction at the northern end of the Oxford Canal an hour or so before midnight on Monday the 20th of June. The distance from Hawkesbury Junction down to Oxford is some 77 miles. We may therefore assume that, even with 1 or 2 protracted stops along the route, the double crew of the flyboat should have managed the journey within about 36 hours, and this appears to have been the case. What now follows is a reconstruction of those crucial hours based upon the evidence given at the subsequent trials, for there were 2 of them, and upon later research undertaken by the present author into the records of the Canal Company and the Pickford & Co. archives. From all the available evidence, one fact stands out, stark and incontrovertible. The body of Joanna Franks was found just after 5:30 a.m. on Wednesday the 22nd of June in the water known as Duke's Cut, about 2.5 miles north of the canal terminus at Hayfield Wharf in the city of Oxford. For the moment, however, let us jump forward in time. After a coroner's inquest at the Running Horses Inn, now demolished but formerly standing by Hythe Bridge, the 4 crew members of the Barbara Bray were straightly charged with the murder of Joanna Franks, and were duly committed to Oxford Jail. In the preliminary trial held at the Summer Assizes of August 1859, there were 3 indictments against these men: the wilful murder of Joanna Franks by throwing her into the canal, rape upon the said woman, and the stealing of various articles, the property of her husband. To a man the crew pleaded not guilty of all charges, and in the event Wootton, the boy, who was originally charged with them, was not named in the final indictments. Mr. Sergeant Williams, for the prosecution, said he should first proceed on the charge of rape. However, the judge, Mr. Justice Traherne, decided that there could be no certain proof of the prisoners having committed the crime, and the jury was therefore directed to return a verdict of not guilty on that charge. Mr. Williams then applied to the court for a postponement of the trial for murder until the next assizes, on the grounds that a material witness, Joseph Jarnell, formerly a co-prisoner in Oxford Jail, and previously committed for bigamy, could not be heard before the court until he had obtained a free pardon from the Secretary of State. Oldfield, the boat's captain, was understood to have made some disclosure to Jarnell while the 2 men shared the same cell. Although this request was opposed by Oldfield's counsel, Mr. Judge Traherne finally consented to the suggested postponement. The judge appointed for the second trial, held in April 1860, was Mr. Augustus Benham. There was intense public feeling locally, and the streets were lined with hostile crowds. The 3 prisoners appeared at the bar wearing the leather belts and sleeve waistcoats usually worn by the canal boatmen, and were duly charged with wilful murder by casting, pushing, and throwing the said Joanna Franks into the canal, by which means she was choked, suffocated, and drowned. What exactly, we must ask, had taken place on those last few fatal miles above the stretch of water known as Duke's Cut, The tragic story soon began to unfold itself. The journey from Preston Brook down to the top of the Oxford Canal at Hawkesbury was comparatively uneventful, although it soon became known that Oldfield had sat with Joanna in the cabin while the boat was negotiated through the Northwich and Harecastle tunnels. However, from the time the Barbara Bray reached the lonely locks of Knapton Junction, with Oxford still some 50 miles distant, the story appears to change dramatically. William Stevens, a canal clerk employed by Pickford & Co., confirmed that the Barbara Bray reached Knapton Lock at about 11 a.m. on Tuesday the 21st of June, and that the boat remained there for about an hour and a half. Immediately Joanna complained to Stevens about the conduct of the men. Stevens suggested that the woman report to the company offices in Oxford, where a partial offloading of the boat's cargo was officially scheduled, and where it should be possible for her to switch to another boat on the last leg of her journey. Stevens also witnessed some shouted altercations between Joanna and a member of the crew, and remembered hearing Joanna speak the words, "Leave me alone, I'll have nothing to do with you." What seemed obvious to Stevens was that the crew were beginning to get very much the worse for drink, and he gave it as his opinion that they were making very free with the spirit, which was the cargo. Before setting off, the woman complained again, and Stevens repeated his advice to her to reconsider her position once the boat reached the terminus. It appears that Stevens' advice did not go unheeded. At Banbury, Joanna made a determined effort to seek alternative transport. Matthew Lawrenson, wharfinger at Tooley's Yard, remembered most clearly Joanna's urgent inquiries about the times of immediate coaches to London, and coaches from Oxford to Banbury. But nothing was convenient. Lawrenson gave it as his general impression that the unfortunate woman was somewhat flushed and afeared. As it happened, Joanna was now to have a fellow passenger for a brief period, since Agnes Lawrenson, the wharfinger's wife, herself travelled on the Barbara Bray down to King's Sutton Lock, 5 miles distant. She too gave evidence at the trial. She stated that Joanna may have had a drink, but that she seemed completely sober, unlike Oldfield and Musson, and that she was clearly very agitated. It was the landlord of the Crown and Castle at Aynhoe who was to provide some of the most damning testimony of all. When Mrs. Lawrenson left the boat 3 miles upstream, it would appear that Joanna could trust herself with the drunken boatman no longer. According to the landlord, at about 10 p.m. she'd arrived at Aynhoe on foot. She confessed that she was so frightened of the lecherous drunkards on the Barbara Bray that she determined to walk along the towpath, even at that late hour, and to take her chances with footpads and cut-purses. She hoped, she said, that it would be possible for her to rejoin the boat later, when its crew might be a few degrees more sober. Whilst she waited for the boat, the landlord offered her a glass of stout, but Joanna declined. He kept an eye on her, however, and noticed that as she sat on the edge of the canal, she appeared to be secretly sharpening a knife on the side of the lock. Musson was later found to have a cut in his left cheek, which was probably made by the same knife. As the boat drew alongside Aynhoe Wharf, one of the crew cursed the eyes of the woman, and wished her in hell flames, for he loathed and detested the very sight of her. As she finally reboarded the boat, the landlord remembered seeing Joanna being offered a drink, and in fact he thought she might have taken a glass. But this evidence must be discounted wholly, since Mr. Bartholomew Samuels, the surgeon who conducted an immediate post-mortem, found no evidence whatsoever of any alcohol in poor Joanna's body. George Bloxham, the captain of a northward-bound Pickford boat, testified that he had drawn alongside Oldfield's boat just below Aynhoe, and that Oldfield had referred to his woman passenger in disgusting terms, vowing in the crudest language what he would do with her that very night. Bloxham added that Oldfield was very drunk, and Musson, and Towns too. James Robson, keeper of the Somerton Deep Lock, said that he and his wife Anna were awakened at about midnight by a scream of terror coming from the direction of the lock. When they looked down from their bedroom window, they saw only some men by the side of the boat, and a woman seated on top of the cabin, with her legs hanging over the side. 3 things the Robsons were able to recall. Joanna had called out in a terrified voice, "I'll not go down, don't attempt me!" Then one of the crew had shouted, "Mind her legs! Mind her legs!" After that, the passenger had resumed her frightened screams. "What have you done with me shoes? Oh, please tell me!" Anna Robson inquired who the woman was, and was told, "A passenger, don't worry." the crewman adding that she was having words with her husband, who was with her aboard. Forbidding to Joanna as the tall lock-house must have appeared that midnight, standing sentinel-like above the black waters, it presented her with her one last chance of life, had she sought asylum within its walls. But she made no such request. After Gibraltar Lock, Joanna must have taken another walk, since Robert Bond, a crew hand from the narrowboat Isis, gave evidence that he passed her on the towpath. Bond recalled asking her if all was well, but she only nodded and passed on into the night. As he approached Gibraltar Lock, Bond had met Oldfield's boat, and was asked by one of its crew if he had seen a woman walking the towpath, the man adding, in the crudest terms, what he would do to her once he had her in his clutches once again. No one, apart from the evil boatman on the Barbara Bray, was ever to see Joanna Franks alive again. As with Part 1, Morse, as he read through the unhappy narrative, felt vaguely dissatisfied. Something was nagging at his brain about Part 1, and he was unable to put his finger on it. Still, it would come back to him once he'd reread a few pages. No hurry, was there? And yet the doubts persisted in his brain. Could anyone read this story and not find himself questioning one or two of the points so confidently reported? Or two, or three, or four? What was the normal entertainment for canal boatmen like Oldfield on those stops of theirs? Changing horses was obviously one key activity, but scarcely one calculated to gladden every soul. Dropping in at the local knocking shop, then, a likely port of call, and drink. Why not? What else was there to do? And though drink might take away the performance, who could gainsay that it frequently provoked the desire? The desire, in this case, to rape a beautiful woman passenger. But if sex was at the bottom of things, why were the rape charges dropped at the first trial? Agreed there was no DNA fingerprinting in the 1850s, but even in that era the charges of rape could often be made to stick without too much difficulty. And what was all that about shoes? How did they figure in the story? One of the crewmen might, perhaps, have been a foot fetishist. Telling himself not to be so stupid, Morse looked again at the last pages of the text. What about Mrs. Lawrenson? Whatever the situation had been with Joanna, this Lawrenson woman, with her husband's full assent, one must assume, had joined the Barbara Bray for the journey down to King's Sutton with, one was led to believe, a boatload of sexually rampant dipsomaniacs. Difficult to swallow? Unless, of course, the wharfinger Lawrenson was perfectly happy to get rid of his missus for the night, or for any night. But such a line of reasoning seemed fanciful, and there was a further possibility, a very simple one, that the crew had not been all that blotto at the time. But no, every piece of evidence surely pointed in the opposite direction. Such were some of Morse's thoughts after reading the second instalment, and it must be admitted that Morse had almost totally failed to conceive the real problems raised by the Colonel's text. His thought processes were clear, but for the time being he was far below his best. What he really needed was to stand that bit further back from the picture. After Morse reread Part 2, he seemed to see little more in general terms than he'd done earlier, although there were a few extra points of detail which he stored away haphazardly in his brain. There were those journeys through the two tunnels, when Oldfield had sat with Joanna, or when, as Morse translated things, he put his arm around the frightened girl in the eerie darkness and told her not to be afraid. On those last confusing paragraphs, Joanna had been desperately anxious to get off the boat and away from her persecutors. So much seemed beyond any reasonable doubt. But if so, why had she always been so anxious to get back on again? Airy-fairy speculation, all this, but there were things that could be factually checked. Nothing was convenient, it had said. But what was available at the time Joanna reached Banbury? Any researcher worth his salt could easily verify that. He could also discover how much any alternative route to London would have cost. What, for example, was the rail fare to London in 1859, or for that matter between Liverpool and London, a fare which appeared to have been beyond the Franks' joint financial resources? Interesting. As, come to think of it, were the quotation marks in the text, presumably the actual words reported verbatim. Morse looked through the quotations again, and one in particular caused his mind to linger. coaches to London and coaches from Oxford to Banbury. If those were the exact words Joanna had used, why had she asked for the times of the coaches from Oxford to Banbury? Surely she should have been asking about the coaches from Banbury to Oxford. Again, it all seemed most interesting, at least to Morse. And what, finally, was he to make of that drink business? Had Joanna been drinking, or had she not? There was some ambivalence in the text, a few conflicting statements. But no, that was impossible. Mr. Bartholomew Samuels had found no alcohol in Joanna's body, and that was that. The thought of drink began to concentrate Morse's mind powerfully, and with great circumspection and care, he poured a finger of scotch into his bedside glass with the same amount of plain water. Wonderful! No one ever believed that scotch was a necessary stimulant to his brain cells, but after a few minutes his mind was flooding with ideas, exciting ideas, and furthermore he could begin to test one or two of his hypotheses that very evening. That is, if Walter Greenaway's daughter came to visit. As she walked down Broad Street the following morning, Christine Greenaway was still thinking, about the man who had spoken to her the previous evening in Ward 7C. He'd asked her to look up something for him in the Bodley. He'd seemed so earnest, so grateful. And that was silly, really, because she'd willingly have helped him anyway. That's why she'd become a librarian in the first place. And now she was the senior of the 3 librarians who sat at the northern end of the Bodleians' lower reading room, where she offered assistance to both senior and junior members of the university. She climbed the wooden staircase to the lower reading room and hung her coat in the librarian's cloakroom. It was always tedious, that first hour, clearing up the books left on the tables from the previous day. She thought back to the brief passages of conversation the previous evening. "You work at the Bodleian, I hear." "Uh-huh." It is a bit of a cheek, not knowing you, but you'd like me to look something up for you." She'd known he was some sort of policeman. Things like that get round the wards pretty quickly. And not much to look at, was he? Balding and certainly carrying excess weight around the midriff. But his eyes had held hers for a few seconds, and she had been conscious of their melancholy and their vulnerability. Yet they'd seemed to look deep down inside herself, and to like what they had seen. Forget him, she told herself. Forget him, Christine. She was behaving like some adolescent schoolgirl smitten with a teacher. He'd been rather vague, and it had been difficult precisely to assess what he wanted. Some details about insurance companies in the mid-19th century, especially, if possible, companies in the Midlands. Off and on, during the morning, it took her an hour or more to hunt down the appropriate catalogues, and another hour to locate the pertinent literature. But by lunchtime she'd completed her research. She'd found a work of reference which told her exactly what Morse had wanted her to find. That afternoon, after carefully photocopying her finds, she wished the hours away, for she was impatient to parade the fruits of her research, and she just wanted to see the man again, that was all. Equally, Morse was looking forward to seeing Christine Greenaway once again. So it was that at 7:25 he was sitting erect against his pillows, newly washed, his thinning hair recently recombed, when his stomach suddenly felt as though it was being put through a mangle, and for 2 or 3 minutes the pain refused to relax its grinding, agonizing grip. Morse closed his eyes and squeezed his fists with such force that the sweat stood out on his forehead. Oh dear! Why had he ever considered the pleasure of a little glass? The wages of sin was death, and all mortals he knew were ever treading that narrow way to Judgment Day. But he now prayed that the last few steps in his own case might be deferred at least a week or two. Then, suddenly as it had come, the pain was gone, and Morse opened his eyes once more. The clock was showing 7:30 when the visitors began to filter through, with their offerings stashed in Sainsbury or St. Michael carriers, and some with bunches of blooms. But life, alas, is full of disappointments, and it was an unexpected visitor who was to monopolize Morse's time that evening. Bearing a wilting collection of white chrysanthemums, a sombre-looking woman of late middle age proceeded to commandeer the sole chair set at his bedside. "Mrs. Green, how nice of you to come!" Morse's heart sank. It was wonderfully good of her to take such trouble to come. 3 buses, as he knew full well, but he found himself willing her to get up and go. On several occasions from her father's bedside, Christine Greenaway half-turned, and 2 or 3 times her eyes locked with Morse's, hers with a smile of understanding, his with all the impotence of some stranded whale. Finally, at 8:05, after half a dozen "I really must goes," Mrs. G. rose to her pearly feet with instructions for the care of the chrysanthemums. And at last, after a mercifully brief account of her latest visit to her chiropodist, Mrs. G. dragged her long-suffering feet away from Ward 7C. Just as Mrs. Green was on her way, a white-coated consultant decided to give 10 minutes of his time to Greenaway Senior, and then, in some sotto voce asides, to confide his prognosis to Greenaway Junior. For Morse, this hiatus was getting about as infuriating as waiting for breakfast in some Faulty Towers hotel. Then Lewis came. Never had Morse been less glad to see his sergeant, yet he had instructed Lewis to pick up his post from the flat. He now took possession of several envelopes and a couple of cards. Morse's shoes, his other pair, were ready for collection. His car licence was due to be renewed within 20 days. A bill from the plumber was still unpaid. The Wagner Society asked if he wanted to enter his name in a raffle for Bayreuth Ring tickets. It was rather like life, his usual correspondence. Half of it was fine, and half of it he wanted to forget. At 8:23, Lewis asked if there was anything else he could do. "Yes, Lewis, please go, will you? I want to have 5 minutes with—" Morse nodded vaguely over to Greenaway's bed. "What? That's what you want, sir?" Lewis rose slowly to his feet. "It is what I bloody want, Lewis. I just told you, haven't I?" Lewis took a large bunch of white seedless grapes from his carrier bag. We thought you'd enjoy them, sir." He was gone, and Morse knew within a second that he would not be forgiving himself easily for such monumental ingratitude. But the damage was done. The bell rang 2 minutes later, and Christine came across as she left and handed him 6 large photocopied sheets. "I hope this is what you wanted." "I'm so grateful. It's a pity we didn't have a chance to—" "I do understand," she said. "And you will let me know if I can do anything else?" "Look, perhaps—" "Come along now, please." The charge nurse's voice sounded almost as imperious as Nessie's as she walked quickly round the beds. "I'm so grateful," said Morse. "I really am. Will you be in tomorrow?" "No, not tomorrow. We've got some librarians coming from California." "Come along now, please." Mrs. Green, Sergeant Lewis, Christine Greenaway, now all of them were gone, and Morse felt sick at heart. Finally, he settled back against his piled pillows to glance through the photocopies Christine had found for him, and soon he was deeply engrossed, his temporary despondency departing on the instant. The document which Morse now handled was just the thing. The Insurance Guide and Handbook, 1860. Bless the girl! She'd even got the exact year. It was interesting to find that by the middle of the 19th century, people were beginning to live longer, and that insurance companies were beginning to match this phenomenon with increasingly attractive rates and premiums, in spite of the sombre statistics appended. E.g., for 1859, of the 500,000 or so departed souls reported in the guide, 55,000 had died of consumption, 25,000 of pneumonia, 24,500 of convulsions, 23,000 of bronchitis, 19,000 of typhus, 15,000 of diarrhea, 14,000 of heart disease, 12,000 of whooping cough, 11,000 of dropsy, 9,000 of apoplexy, 6,000 of asthma, 5,750 of cancer, 4,000 of teeth troubles, 3,750 of measles, 3,250 of smallpox, 3,000 of mothers giving birth, and so on to smaller numbers succumbing to diseases of brain, kidney, liver, and other perishable parts, and to old age. As he added up such numbers quickly in his head, Morse realized that about 2/3 of the 500,000 were unaccounted for, and he had to assume that even with a few more categories added, murder for one, there must have been vast numbers of people in those days whose deaths were for some reason not specifically accounted for at all. Perhaps a lot of them were just not important enough to get their own particular malady spelled out on any death certificate. Perhaps the physicians, midwives, nurses, poor law attendants or whatever just didn't know or didn't care. As he lay back in the pillows and thought of the luckless Joanna Franks, who had died neither of consumption nor pneumonia, nor... He suddenly fell into a sleep so deep that he missed his 10 o'clock Horlicks and digestive biscuit, and then he woke again at 11:45 with a dry throat and a clear head. The lights in the ward were turned down to half power, and the other patients seemed contentedly asleep. He'd just had a nasty little dream. He'd been playing cricket at grammar school, and when it came to his turn to bat, he couldn't find his boots. And then when he did find them, the laces kept snapping. It might have been Mrs. Green talking about a chiropody, or Lewis, perhaps, who bought the card from the cobblers, or neither. Was it not more likely to have been a young woman in 1859 who shouted, with a particular brand of terrified despair, "What have you done with me shoes?" He looked around again. Surely he wasn't likely to imperil the well-being of the ward if he turned on his angle lamp, especially if focused directly into a small pool of light on his own pillows. No, reading a book wasn't going to hurt anyone. He turned on his light. Part 3 of Murder on the Oxford Canal was close to hand, but Morse was reluctant to finish that too quickly. He wanted to eke it out, which left the blue ticket. Morse was soon well into the exploits of a blonde, who should have had arrows on her black stockings pointing northward and reading, "This way for the knickers." That is, if she'd worn any stockings, or worn any knickers for that matter. And it was amid much parading of bodies, pawing of bosoms, and patting of buttocks, that Morse now became engrossed. "What do you think you're doing?" "I was just... Lights go out at 10 o'clock. You're disturbing everyone on the ward. They're all asleep. Not for much longer with you around. What's this you're reading?" Before he could do anything about it, Nessie had removed the book from his hands. He watched her helplessly as she skimmed a couple of paragraphs. "Time you were asleep," she said, handing back the book. Morse replaced the ill-starred volume in his locker. "And be careful of your fruit juice." She moved the half-filled glass 1 millimetre to the left, turned off the light, and was gone. When he was woken, the following morning, he felt wonderfully refreshed, and he resolved that he would take no risks of any further humiliation over the blue ticket. With breakfast, temperature, wash, shave, blood pressure, newspaper, tablets behind him, he settled down to discover exactly what had happened to that young woman in 1859. Part 3. A protracted trial. Joanna Franks' body was found at Duke's Cut at about 5:30 a.m. on Wednesday the 22nd of June. Philip Tomes, a boatman, said he was passing down canal when he saw something in the water. The object was on the side of the canal opposite the towpath, and in due course he discovered it to be the body of a female, without either bonnet or shoes. She was floating alongside the bank, lying on her face, which seemed quite black. Tomes stopped his boat, and with a boat hook gently pulled the body to the towpath side, where he lifted it out of the water. In this task he was assisted by John Ward, a Kidlington fisherman who happened to be passing alongside the canal at that early hour. In fact, it was Ward who had the presence of mind to arrange for the body, which was still warm, to be taken to the plough-in at Wolvercote. It appears from various strands of evidence, albeit some of it from the guilty parties themselves, that Oldfield and Musson, and by one account Towns also, left the Barbara Bray at roughly the point where Joanna met her death, and that they were seen standing on the towpath side of the canal just below Duke's Cut. A certain man passed by the area at the crucial time, 4 a.m. or just after, and both Oldfield and Musson, with great presence of mind, asked him if he had seen a woman walking beside the canal. The man replied they recalled with a very definite no, and made to get further on his way with all speed. Yet the men had asked him the same question again and again in an agitated manner. It is clear that this man's testimony could have been vital in substantiating the boatman's claims, but he was never traced, in spite of wide-scale inquiries in the area. A man roughly answering his description, one Donald Favant, had signed the register at the Nag's Head in Oxford for the 20th of June, but this man never came forward. The strong implication must therefore remain that the whole story was the clever concoction of desperate men. Jonas Bamsey, wharfinger at Hayfield Wharf, gave evidence that the Barbara Bray had duly effected its partial unloading, but that Oldfield had not reported the loss of any passenger, which certainly should have been the duty of a boat's captain. Instead, the boatmen appeared to have confided in some of their canal-side acquaintances, claiming that their passenger had been out of her mind, that she had committed suicide, and that on at least one occasion they'd been called upon to save her from an attempted drowning on the journey down from Preston Lock. Later that dreadful day, when the crew of the Barbara Bray came to negotiate the lock at Iffley, 2 miles downstream, Oldfield spoke to the keeper, Albert Lee, and reported that a passenger on his boat had been drowned, but that she was most sadly deranged, and had been a sore trial to him and his fellow crew members ever since she had first embarked. Oldfield was still obviously very drunk. Pressed to explain what he was seeking to say, Oldfield asserted only that it was a very bad job that had happened. The passenger was off her head, and had been last seen by the crew off Gibraltar Lock. All this made Lee more than somewhat suspicious. On the departure of the Barbara Bray, therefore, he himself immediately set off for the Pickford office. The Pickford office, in turn, contacted the police authority. When the infamous boat finally arrived at Reading, Constable Harrison was on hand, with appropriate support, to take the entire crew into custody, and testify that all of them, including the youth, were still observably drunk. He escorted them to the jail at Reading. One of them, as Harrison vividly recalled, was heard to mutter, "Damn and blast that wicked woman!" Hannah McNeill, a serving woman at the Plough in Wolvercote, testified that when the sodden body had been brought from the canal, she had been employed to take off Joanna's clothes. The left sleeve was torn out of its gathers, and the cuff on the same hand was also torn. Tomes and Ward, for their part, were quite firm in their evidence that they had made no rips or tears in Joanna's clothing as they lifted her from the water. Catherine Madison testified that she was a co-helper with Hannah McNeill in taking off Joanna's drenched garments. Particularly she had noticed the state of Joanna's calico knickers, which had been ripped right across the front. This garment was produced in court, and the production of such an intimate item served further to heighten the universal feeling of revulsion against these callous men. Mr. Samuels, the surgeon who examined the body at the inquest, reported signs of bruising below the elbow of the left arm, and further subcutaneous bruising below left and right cheekbones. The same man described the dead woman's face as presenting a state of discoloration and disfigurement. Mr. Samuels agreed that it was perhaps possible for the facial injuries to have been caused by accidental incidents in the water, or in the process of taking up from the water. The youth Wootton then gave his version of the tragic events, and on one point he expressed himself forcefully that Towns had got himself good and half seas over the night before Joanna was found, and that he was sound asleep at the time the murder must have occurred, for he, Wootton, had heard him snoring loudly. We shall never know whether Towns forced Wootton to give this evidence to the court, under some threat or other perhaps. From subsequent developments, however, it seems clear that we may give a substantial degree of credence to Wootton's testimony. Joseph Jarnell, the co-prisoner pending whose evidence the retrial had been agreed, related to the court the confessions Oldfield had betrayed whilst the two men shared a prison cell. In essence, this amounted to a crude attempt on Oldfield's part to settle the majority of blame for what happened on Musson and Towns, but in spite of the man's earnest manner, Jarnell's story made little or no impression. Yet his testimony carried interest. Amongst the strongest of Oldfield's fabrications was that Joanna Franks had had in excess of 50 golden sovereigns in one of her 2 boxes, that Towns had discovered this fact, that Joanna had found him rummaging through her trunks and had threatened to report him to the next Pickford's office if he did not make immediate apology and restoration. Such nonsense, of course, was wholly discredited at the time, and may be safely discounted now. Together with other items, the knife which Joanna had been observed sharpening was later found in one of her trunks, the cord of which had been cut. The assumption was that, at some point, the men had opened her belongings after the murder and had replaced the knife. Out of all the evidence given at that memorable second trial, certainly that of Charles Franks himself evoked the greatest feeling and widest sympathy. The poor man was weeping aloud as he entered the witness box, and it seemed as if it were almost beyond his physical powers to raise his eyes and look upon the prisoners' faces. He'd obviously been deeply in love with Joanna, and turning his back on the vile men, he explained how, in consequence of some information, he had come into Oxfordshire and seen his wife's dead body at the time of the inquest. For although it was dreadfully disfigured, here the poor fellow could not at all restrain his feelings, he knew it by a small mark behind his wife's left ear, a mark of which only a parent or an intimate lover could have known. Corroboration of identification, if in fact it was needed, was afforded by the shoes, later found in the fore-cabin of the Barbara Bray, which matched in the minutest degrees the contours of the dead woman's feet. At the conclusion of the hearing, and after a lengthy summing up by Mr. Augustus Benham, the jury begged permission of his lordship to retire to consider their verdict. Morse knew that something, whatever it was, had prodded him at last into a slightly more intelligent appraisal of the Colonel's story, because he now began to take account of 2 or 3 considerations which had been staring at him all the while. The first was the character of Joanna Franks herself. How had it come about that the crew of the Barbara Bray insisted time and time again that the wretched woman had been nothing but one long sorry trial to them, ever since she first jumped on board at Preston Brook? How was it that they were still damning and blasting the poor woman's soul to eternity, way, way after they'd pushed her into the canal, and, for all anyone knew, held her head under the black waters until she writhed in agony against their murderous hands no longer? Had a satisfactory explanation been forthcoming for such events? All right, there was still part 4 of the story to come. But so far the answer was no. There was, though, one possible dimension to the case that the good Colonel had never even hinted at. Namely, that Joanna Franks had been a seductive tease. A woman who, over those long hours of that long journey, had begun to drive the crew towards jealousy and insanity with her provocative overtures. Come off it, Morse. There was no evidence to support such a view, none. Yet the thought stayed with him, reluctant to leave. An attractive woman, boredom, drink, a tunnel, continued boredom, more drink, another tunnel, darkness, desire, opportunity, still more drink, all that. What if Joanna herself had craved for the men just as much as they had craved for her? What if she'd wanted sex just as badly as they did? Men's questions, he heard a voice say. Just the sort of thoughts that would occur to an ageing MCP like you. Nevertheless, there was a second general consideration. In the courtroom, the odds did seem to have been stacked pretty heavily against the crew of the Barbara Bray, with presumption of innocence playing decidedly second fiddle to assumption of guilt. Even the Colonel had let his judgments run away with him a little. He'd already decided that any ostensible concern on the part of the boatman for the missing passenger was only shown with great presence of mind in order to establish an alibi for themselves. Yet these same boatmen had manoeuvred their infamous craft down to Reading, still obviously very drunk. But, Morse asked himself, did wicked men tend to get more drunk or more sober after committing such callous crimes? Interesting thought. Yes, and there was a third point, one that seemed to Morse most curious. The charges both of theft and rape had, for some reason, been dropped against the boatmen. Was this because the prosecution had been wholly confident and decided to go for the graver charge of murder, with expectation that they had sufficient evidence to convict Rory, Oldfield and co.? Or was it, perhaps, because they had too little confidence in their ability to secure convictions on the lesser charges? Was it just possible that these charges were dropped because there was no convincing evidence to support them? Certainly, as far as multiple rape was concerned, the evidence must have been decidedly dodgy, as the judge in the first trial had pronounced. But what about theft? The prerequisite of theft was that the victim possessed something worth the stealing. So what was it that poor Joanna had about her person or in her 2 travelling boxes that was worth the crime? The evidence, after all, pointed to the fact that she hadn't got a couple of pennies to rub together. A fare for the canal trip had been sent up from her husband in London, and even facing a drunken, lecherous crew, certainly after Banbury had been reached, she had not taken, or not been able to take, any alternative means of transport to get her to the Edgware Road. So what had she got, if anything, that was worth stealing? There were those shoes again, too. Did Joanna deliberately leave off her shoes? Did she enjoy the feel of the mud between her toes along the towpath, like some barefoot hippie on a watery dawn walk round Stonehenge? What a strange case it had been. The more Morse thought about it, the greater the number of questions that kept occurring to his mind. He had a good deal of experience in cases where the forensic and pathological evidence had been vital to the outcome of a case, and he wasn't particularly impressed with the conclusions drawn from Mr. Samuel's findings. For Morse, the state of the dress and the bruising described would have been much more consistent with Joanna being held firmly from behind, with an assailant's left hand gripping her left wrist, and his right hand being held forcibly across her mouth, where thumb and forefinger would produce the sort of bruising mentioned in the record. And what of this Jarnell fellow? The prosecution must have been considerably impressed at the first hearing with his potential testimony. Why otherwise would anybody be willing to postpone a trial for 6 months on the word of a jailbird? So why was it, then, that when he duly turned up at the second trial, no one wished to listen to him? The one vital point Jarnell disclosed was that Oldfield had not only protested his own innocence, but had also sought to shift all responsibility onto his fellow crewmen. Not, to be sure, a very praiseworthy piece of behaviour, yet if Oldfield himself were innocent, where else could he have laid the blame? And whatever accusations could be levelled against Oldfield, the charge of inconsistency was not amongst them. On 3 occasions after Joanna's death, he had insisted that she was out of her mind, sadly deranged, off her head. It was just a little worrying, that was all, the way the dice had been loaded against those drunkards who had murdered Joanna Franks. And the niggling doubt persisted. If they had. Doubtless at the time the jury's verdict had looked safe and satisfactory. But should the verdict have been reached? True, there was enough circumstantial suspicion to sentence a saint, yet no really direct evidence, was there? No witnesses to murder, no indication of how the murder had been committed, no convincing motive for why. Just a time and a place, and Joanna lying face downwards in Duke's Cut. Unless, of course, there were some passages of evidence omitted by the Colonel. Perhaps it would be of some interest to have a quick look through the court registers, or through the relevant copies of Jackson's Oxford Journal. And in any case, he hadn't finished the Colonel's book yet. There might be much still to be revealed in that last episode, which he now began to read. Almost immediately he was conscious of Fiona standing beside him, the amply bosomed Fiona, smelling vaguely of the summer and strongly of disinfectant. She looked over his shoulder. "Interesting?" Morse nodded. "It's the book the old girl brought round, you know, the Colonel's wife." Then Fiona took off one of her flat-heeled black shoes and shook out some invisible irritant onto the ward floor. "Why do people take their shoes off?" asked Morse. "Normally, I mean." "Funny question." "When they've a stone in them, like you, and—" "Well, when they go paddling at Blackpool." "Yes." "When they sit watching the telly." "Anything else?" "If their feet get sore or tired, or if they have to take the tights off for some reason." "Such as?" Morse saw the flash of sensuous amusement in her eyes. "Well, if you don't know at your age—" Oh dear. Age. Suddenly Morse could see himself as he was seen by this young girl. Old. But his mood was soon brightened by the totally unexpected appearance of Sergeant Lewis, whose purpose, he explained, was to interview a woman in intensive care in connection with yet another horrendous crash on the A34. "Feeling okay, sir?" "I shall feel a jolly sight better once I've apologised for being so bloody ungrateful." "Oh, yeah, when was that, sir? I thought you were always ungrateful." "I'm just sorry, that's all." Lewis, whose anger had been simmering like soup left on the stove, had come into the ward with considerable reluctance. Yet when some 10 minutes later he walked out, he felt the same degree of delight he invariably experienced when he knew that Morse needed him, even if only to do a bit of mundane research. Morse had asked him to discover if the court registers of the Oxford Assizes, 1859-60, were still available, and if so, to see if any records of the trials were still extant. After Lewis had gone, Morse felt very much more in tune with the universe. Lewis had forgiven him, and with Lewis looking into the court registers, there was another researcher in the field, a qualified librarian, who could very quickly sort out Jackson's Oxford journals. Not that she was coming in that evening, alas. Patience Morse. He turned once again to the final episode of the late Colonel Deniston's book. Part 4. A Pronounced Sentence. A bailiff was sworn in to attend the jury, who immediately retired to the Clerk of Indictment's room. After an absence of 3/4 of an hour, they returned to the court. In reply to the usual questions from Mr. Benham, the foreman replied that the jury was all agreed, and that they were unanimous in finding the 3 prisoners at the bar guilty of the murder of Joanna Franks. The black coif was placed on the judge's head, and after asking the prisoners if they had anything to say, he passed his sentence. Jack Oldfield, Alfred Musson, Walter Towns, you have each been found guilty of the most foul crime of murder, the murder of an unoffending and helpless woman who was under your protection, and who, there is no doubt, was the object of your lust, and, thereafter, to prevent detection of your crime, the object of your cruelty. Look not for pardon in this world, but prepare yourselves for the ignominious death which now awaits you. This case is one of the most painful, the most disgusting, and the most shocking that has ever come to my knowledge, and it must remain only for me to pass upon you the terrible and just sentence of the law. After the trial was over and sentence pronounced, the 3 men still persisted in maintaining their innocence. It had seemed reasonably clear from various statements, including those of Oldfield and Musson, that Towns had been somewhat less involved in the happenings on the canal journey than the other 2. Some members of the legal profession therefore now thought that there was a case for reconsideration of the sentence imposed upon Towns. As a result of their representations, Towns was reprieved at the 11th hour. The news was broken to him as the 3 men were receiving, for the last time, the Holy Sacrament from the prison chaplain. Towns immediately burst into tears, and taking each of his former associates by the hand, kissed them affectionately, repeating, "God bless you, dear friend. God bless you." He was later transported to Australia, where he was still alive in 1884. In that year he was interviewed by one Samuel Carter, like Oldfield and Towns, a citizen of Coventry, who took a lively interest in local history, and who recorded his experiences in his book Travels and Talks in the Antipodes, Farthing Hill Press, Nottingham, 1886. Oldfield and Musson were duly hanged in public. As many as 10,000 people were estimated to have witnessed the macabre spectacle. It is reported that from an early hour men sat high on walls, climbed trees, and even perched on the roofs of overlooking houses in order to obtain a good view of those terrible events. Not a square foot of space was to be found when, at the appointed hour of 11 o'clock, the execution finally occurred. The 2 men walked with firm step to the platform and ascended the stairs to the drop without assistance. When the ropes had been adjusted around their necks, the executioner shook hands with each man, and then, as the chaplain intoned his melancholy service, the fatal bolt was drawn, and in a minute or 2, after much convulsion, the wretched malefactors were no more. The gallows appeared to have sated the sadistic fascination of the mob, for there are no reports of any disorders as the great throng dispersed homewards on that sunlit day. It was later disclosed that Oldfield's last action in life had been to hand to the chaplain a postcard to be delivered to his young wife, in which to the very end he proclaimed his innocence of the crime for which he had paid the ultimate penalty. But it is all a long time ago now, and no one today can point with any certainty to the shabby plot in the environs of Oxford jail, where notorious criminals and murderers, and others of the damned, were once buried. It was such a good story, Morse told himself. So it was no surprise that the Colonel had disinterred the bare bones of this particular one from the hundreds of other 19th-century burial grounds. Beauty and the Beasts, that's what it was, quintessentially. At least, as the Colonel had seen it. For Morse, who had long ago rejected the bland placebos of conventional religion, the facility offered to errant souls to take the Holy Sacrament before being barbarously strangled seemed oddly at variance with the ban on the burial of these same souls within some so-called holy ground. But it was good that Oldfield's wife had stood beside her husband, for better or for worse, and a pretty bloody worse it had turned out to be. She must have found it well-nigh impossible that her husband could commit so foul a deed. How interesting it would have been to know something of her story, too. How Morse would have liked to have been able to interview her then and there. No chance of any interview now, though. Not with any of them. But suddenly it struck Morse that perhaps there was. Samuel Carter's Travels and Talks in the Antipodes. That might be an interesting document, surely. And it would certainly be somewhere on the shelves of the Bodleian. Lewis had already been given his research project, and work was now beginning to pile up for his second researcher in the field, what with Jackson's Oxford Journal, and now Carter's book. Had the Colonel consulted that? Must have done, Morse supposed, which was a little disappointing. That Friday evening, Morse was visited by both Sergeant Lewis and Christine Greenaway, the latter suddenly changing her mind and foregoing a cocktail reception. No trouble at all, just the opposite. Morse was very happy. On Saturday, Christine Greenaway pushed through the doors of the Westgate Central Library. Earlier that morning she'd telephoned one of her acquaintances in the reference section and learned that she could have immediate access to Jackson's Oxford Journal for 1859 to 1860. Perhaps Morse had been right. It was going to be easy. On the second floor, in the local history and study area, she was soon seated in front of a microfilm reader, an apparatus resembling the upper half of a telephone kiosk, with a vertical surface some 2 feet square, upon which the photographed sheets of the newspaper appeared. The controls had been preset for her by a helpful young assistant, and Christine had only to turn a winding handle to skip through the pages, at whatever speed she wished, of Jackson's Oxford Journal. She was relieved, nevertheless, to discover that the journal was a weekly, not a daily publication. Very soon she found the columns relating to the first trial of August 1859, and was making a series of notes about what she found, and, like Morse, becoming more and more interested. Indeed, by the time that she had finished her research into the second 1860 trial, she was fascinated. And she'd found a couple of pieces of information that might please Morse. She hoped so. She was looking quickly through her scribbled notes when she became aware of a conversation taking place behind her at the inquiries desk. "Yes, I've tried County Hall. No help, I'm afraid." "Well, I should think your best bet, then, is the city archivists." "Well, they sent me here." "Oh." The phone rang, and the assistant excused himself to answer it. Christine gathered up her notes, turned off the MFR, and went to the desk. "We met yesterday evening," she began. Sergeant Lewis smiled at her. "Hello." "Seems I'm having more luck than you, Sergeant." "Oh, he always gives me the lousy jobs. I don't know why I bother. Me day off, too. And mine." "Sorry, we can't help, sir," said the assistant, another query dealt with. "But if they've got no trace at the archivists—" Lewis nodded. "Well, thanks anyway." He was escorting Christine to the swing doors when the assistant had a final thought. "You could try St. Aldate's police station. I have heard that quite a lot of stuff got housed by the police in the war, and, well, perhaps—" "Thanks very much." "They can't really be all that helpful to the public, though. I'm sure you know." "Oh, yes." When alone in crowded streets, Christine sometimes felt a little apprehensive, but she experienced a pleasing sense of being under protection as she walked along with the burly figure of Sergeant Lewis beside her. Great Tom was striking noon. "I don't suppose you fancy a drink?" Lewis began. "Not for me, thank you. I don't drink very much, and it's a bit early, isn't it?" Lewis grinned. "That's something I don't hear very often from the chief." But he felt relieved. He wasn't much good at making polite conversation. "You like him, don't you, the chief?" "Oh, he's the best in the business." "Is he? Will you be going in tonight?" "I suppose so. What about you?" "Well, if I find anything, which seems very doubtful at the moment." "Well, you never know." The premises of the City Police HQ in St. Aldate's were being extensively renovated and extended, and the work was still in progress when Sergeant Lewis walked in through the main door. He knew Chief Superintendent Bell fairly well from the old days up at Killington, and was glad to find him in the station. Yes, of course Bell would help if he could. In fact, the timing of Lewis's visit might be opportune, because many corners and crannies had only just been cleared out. The contents of scores of cupboards and dust-covered crates had recently seen the light of day for the first time within living memory. Bell's orders on this had been clear. If any documents seemed worth keeping, let them be kept. If not, let them be destroyed. A whole room had been set aside in which the relics from the earliest days, certainly from the 1850s onwards, had been stacked, and a WPC was, in fact, in there now, so if Lewis wanted to look around. Explaining that this was her lunch break, WPC Wright, a pleasant enough brunette in her mid-20s, continued eating her sandwiches. "It's all yours, Sergeant, or at least I wish it was." Lewis could see what she meant. Morse had given him a copy of the Colonel's work. Several spares had been left on the ward. But for the moment Lewis could see little or no chance of linking anything that had occurred in 1860 with the chaotic heaps of boxes, files, crates, and piles of discoloured, dog-eared documents that lay around. It was clear that a start had been made on sorting things, for 50-odd buff-coloured labels with dates written on them had been set out in chronological order. But Lewis looked in vain for 1859 or 1860. Was it worth having a quick look through the rest? It was at 1:45 that Lewis whistled softly. "Found something. Do you know anything about this?" Lewis lifted from one of the tea chests a chipped and splintered box, about 2 feet long, a foot wide, and about 9 or 10 inches deep. A brass plate set in the top held a handle, also of brass. But what had struck Lewis instantly were the initials engraved upon the plate. J.D. Lewis remembered the 2 boxes which Joanna had taken onto the boat, and which presumably had been found in the cabin after the crew's arrest. And the name of Joanna's first husband had begun with a D. The policewoman came over and lifted the lid to reveal a small rusted key, a pocket comb, a metal spoon, 5 dress buttons, a crochet hook, a packet of needles, 2 flat-heeled, flimsy-looking shoes, and a pair of calico knickers. Lewis shook his head in disbelief. He picked up the shoes gingerly, as if he suspected they might disintegrate. Then, between thumb and forefinger, the calico knickers. "Think I could borrow these shoes and the, WPC Wright eyed him with amused curiosity. "It's all right, they're not for me." "No?" "Morse. I work for Morse. He's become a knicker fetishist in his old age." Lewis grinned. "Well, they'd be a bit small for me, wouldn't they?" During that same Saturday, Morse himself was beginning to feel fine again. Exploring new territory, too, since he was told he was now free to wander along the corridors at will. Thus, at 2:30, he found his way to the day room, which was deserted. After making sure the coast was clear, Morse placed one of the 3 books he was carrying in the large waste paper receptacle, the blue ticket, which had brought him little but embarrassment and humiliation. Then he settled down in an armchair and quietly contemplated the Oxford Canal once more. The question for the jury had not been who committed the crime, but only did the prisoners do it, whilst for a policeman like himself the question would always have to be the first one. So if the boatman didn't do it, who did? Morse hadn't the faintest idea, but he almost felt he could put his finger on the major cause of his unease. It was all those conversations, duly reported, between the principal characters in the story. Conversations between the crew and Joanna, between the crew and the other boatmen, between the crew and the lock-keepers, wharfingers, and constables. All of it wrong, somehow. Wrong if they were guilty. It was as if some inexperienced playwright had been given a murder plot and had then proceeded to write page after page of inappropriate, misleading, and contradictory dialogue. It seemed quite extraordinary that even after the crew had, for some reason, managed to murder Joanna Franks, they were, some 36 hours later, still knocking back the booze, still damning and blasting the woman's soul to eternity. Morse had known many murderers, but never one who had subsequently acted in such a fashion, let alone 4. No, it just didn't add up. Didn't add up at all. He flicked open the index of the stout volume recording the misdeeds of old Salopians, and his eye caught Shropshire Union Canal, brackets the. He turned idly to the reference and read through the paragraph, and with growing interest. The author was still quite incapable of calling a spade anything else but a broad-bladed digging tool, but the message was clear enough. With such an incidence of crime on the canals, it can scarcely be a source of surprise that we find countless instances of evasiveness on the part of many of the boatmen in matters such as the registering of names, Specifically, we discover that many were frequently better known by their bynames than by their christened nomenclature. For varied sociological reasons, it can tentatively be suggested that boatmen, as a generality, were likely to be potentially predisposed to the regular commission of crime, and that their profession afforded ample opportunities for the realization of such potentiality. Sometimes they sold parts of their cargoes, replacing, for example, quantities of coal with similar quantities of rock or stone, and frequently we come across recorded instances of crewmen drinking from their cargoes of fine wines and whiskies, and refilling the emptied bottles with water. Morse laid the book aside. So boatmen were a load of crooks who often nicked bits of their cargoes. Hence Walter Towns, a.k.a. Walter Thorold, and the rest, as simple as that. The youth with the portable saline drip walked in, nodded to Morse, picked up a small TV control panel, and began flicking his way around the channels. It was time for Morse to get back to the ward. As he was leaving, his eyes roamed automatically over the day room's bookcase, and he stopped. On the lower row, side by side, were the titles Victorian Banbury and Oxford, Rail Centres series. Having extracted both, he walked back to the ward. As Morse settled back in his bed, Greenaway, known to his friends it appeared as Waggy, called across, "You're pretty good at crosswords." "Not bad." "Know anything about cricket?" "Not much. What's the clue?" "Bradman's famous duck." "Letters?" 6. Bradman got a duck at the Oval in 1948. "I shouldn't worry about cricket. Just think Walt Disney." Greenaway licked the point of his pencil and thought. "Who's the setter? A chap called Quixote?" Morse smiled. "What was his Christian name?" "Ah, I have you, sir," said Waggy, happily entering the letters. Morse couldn't have chosen a more informative couple of books if he'd sauntered all day around the shelves in the local library. First, from Victorian Banbury, he gleaned the information that by about 1850 the long-distance stagecoach routes to London had been abandoned as a result of the new railway service from Oxford to the capital. Yet as a direct result of this service, stagecoaches between Banbury and Oxford had actually increased. Coaches that would have been available on the day in question, and about which Joanna Franks must have made inquiry, 3 in fact, the following morning, for the sum of 2 shillings 1 penny. Even more interesting for Morse was the situation pertaining at Oxford itself, where trains to Paddington, according to his second work of reference, were far more frequent, no less than 10 trains daily, and presumably Joanna had been presented with exactly the same information, although, admittedly, the fares seemed somewhat steep, with first, second and third-class carriages priced at 16 shillings, 10 shillings and 6 shillings for the 60-odd-mile journey. So, for a few minutes, Morse looked at things from Joanna's point of view. Arriving at Banbury in the latish evening, she would very soon have seen the picture. No chance of anything immediately, but a stay overnight in one of the taverns would certainly cost no more than 2 shillings or so. Then a coach to Oxford next morning to catch a train to Paddington. If she had made a firm decision to escape her tormentors for good, then the situation was straightforward. 2 shillings overnight, say 2 shillings and a penny coach fare, 6 shillings third-class rail fare. For about 10 shillings she could have saved her life. But she hadn't. Why not? Received wisdom maintained that she hadn't got a penny piece to her name, let alone half a guinea. But had she nothing she could sell or pawn? What had she got in those 2 boxes of hers? Nothing of any value whatsoever? But why, if that was so, could there ever have been the slightest suspicion of theft? Morse shook his head slowly. Ye gods, how he wished he could have a quick look into one of those boxes. It was tea time, and Morse was not aware that his wish had already been granted. Normal shifts for the nursing staff were early, late, and night. That Saturday, Eileen Stanton was on late. She'd noticed that Morse spent the afternoon reading. Bookish sort of fellow he seemed. Nice, though. She watched him again at 7:40 as he sat against the pillows, and more particularly watched the woman who sat beside him. To Eileen, the pair of them seemed so eager to talk to each other, and as she watched, the woman placed the tips of her fingers against the sleeve of his gaudy pyjamas. Eileen knew all about that sort of gesture. And what about Morse? He too seemed to be doing his level best to impress her. Oh yes, she could see what each of them was feeling, and she knew she envied them. She now realized a man had been standing patiently at the desk. "Can I help you?" Sergeant Lewis looked down at her. "Special instructions. I've got to report to the boss whenever I bring the Chief Inspector a bag of plastic explosive. You're the boss tonight. And don't be too hard on Sister McLean." "Looks like the Chief's got a visitor for the moment." "Yes." "I'd better not interrupt, had I?" Eileen looked up. "What's he like, Inspector Morse?" Christine Greenaway stood up to go, and Morse was suddenly conscious, as she stood beside the bed, how small she was. Words came back to his mind, the words he'd read recently. A petite and attractive figure. "How tall are you?" he asked. "How small, don't you mean?" Her eyes seemed to mock him. "In stocking feet, I'm 5 feet, half an inch. I wear heels, so I come up to about 5'3". "What size shoes?" "3s. You wouldn't be able to get your feet in them." "I've got very nice feet." "I think I ought to be more worried about my father than about your feet," she said quietly, as she touched his arm once more. Morse in turn placed his own left hand briefly upon hers. "And you'll look up that—" "I won't forget." Then she was gone, and only the smell of some expensive perfume lingered around the bed. "I just wonder," said Morse almost absently as Lewis took Christine's place in the plastic chair, "I just wonder what size shoes Joanna Franks took. I'm assuming, of course, they had shoe sizes in those days. Not a modern invention, are they, like women's tights? What do you think?" "Would you like me to show you exactly what size she did take, sir?" Morse knew that one gift had never been bestowed on him, that of reading quickly. Therefore he seemed to spend a disproportionately long time that evening reading through the photocopied columns from Jackson's journal. Christine had not mentioned she'd returned to the library in the afternoon, and prevailed upon one of her acquaintances to let her photocopy the original material directly. Not that Morse would have exhibited any excessive gratitude. One of his weaknesses was his disposition to accept loyalty without ever appreciating the sacrifices that might be involved. From the newspaper records, it was soon clear that the Colonel had omitted no details of any obvious importance. Yet there were a few details which caused Morse more than a millimetric rise of the eyebrows. First, it seemed fairly clear that the charge of theft had probably been dropped because the evidence, such as it was, had pointed predominantly to the youth, Wootton, therefore necessitating an individual prosecution against a minor. If any of the other crewmen were involved, it was Towns, the man deported to Australia, who figured as the safest bet. Certainly no obvious evidence could be levelled against the two hanged for murder. What was it then that the young man's covetous eyes may have sought to steal from Joanna's baggage? No answer emerged clearly from the evidence, but there was surely one thing above all that thieves went for, then as now. Money. Second, there was evidence to suggest that it was Joanna who was probably the sustaining partner in her second marriage. It was Joanna who had besought her new husband, the ostler from Liverpool, to keep up his spirits during the ill fortune which had beset the early months of their marriage. An extract from a letter to Charles Franks had been read out in court. "Sorry I am," she wrote, "to read, my dear husband, your sadly wandering letter. Do, my dear, strive to rest your tortured mind. The loss of reason is a terrible thing and will blight our hopes. Be strong, and know we shall soon be together and well provided for." Were both of them a bit unbalanced? Third, various depositions made it clear that although flyboats worked best with a two-on-two-off arrangement, it was quite usual in practice for a crew to permutate their different duties in order to accommodate individual requirements. Or desires, perhaps. For Morse now read with considerable interest that Oldfield, captain of the Barbara Bray, had paid Walter Towns 6pence to take over from him in the arduous business of legging the boat through the Barton Tunnel. Fourth, the evidence suggested strongly that for the first half of the journey Joanna had joined in quite happily with the boatmen at the various stops, eating at the same table, drinking with them, laughing at their jokes. And one decisive and dramatic fact, As the crew grew progressively inebriated, Joanna was becoming increasingly sober. For the coroner's evidence was incontestable. No alcohol at all was found in her body. Finally, there was a further passage of evidence which the Colonel had not cited. It was Oldfield's claim that at about 4 a.m. on the fateful morning, the boatman had in fact caught up with Joanna, the latter in a state of much mental confusion. Both he and Musson had discovered her whereabouts only by the anguished cries in which she called upon the name of her husband. "Franks! Franks! Franks!" Oldfield claimed that he had actually persuaded her to get back on the boat, although she had fairly soon jumped off again to resume her walking along the towpath. Then Oldfield and Towns had once more gone ashore, where they met another potential witness, the Donald Favant mentioned in the Colonel's book. But the boatman had not been believed. This second meeting had come in for withering scorn from the prosecution as the invention of these callous murderers. "You comfy?" asked Eileen, pulling the folds of Morse's sheets tidy. "I thought you'd gone off duty. Just going." "You're spoiling me." Before going to sleep that night, Morse's hand glided into the bedside cabinet and poured out a small measure, and as he sipped the scotch, the world of a sudden was none too bad a place. When he awoke the following morning, he marvelled that the blindingly obvious notion that now occurred to him had taken such an age to materialize. Just the same with crossword puzzles, wasn't it? Ponder more and more deeply over some abstruse clue and get nowhere. Stand away, though, further back still, and the answer will shout at you with a sort of mocking triumph. It was those shoes, of course. Shoes at which he'd been staring so hard he hadn't really seen them. When Charles Franks looked at the body, he recognized it, dreadfully disfigured as it was, by a small mark behind his wife's left ear, a mark of which only a parent or an intimate lover could have known. By all the gods, was ever identification so tenuously asserted in the English courts? Some tiny disfigurement in a place where no one else would have been aware of it. Oh, it must have been there, all right. The doctor, the coroner, those who'd undressed the dead woman and redressed her for Christian burial. So many witnesses could corroborate the existence of such a blemish on what had once been such a pretty face. But who could or did corroborate the fact that the face had been Joanna's? The husband? Yes, but the only others who might have known, the parents, where were they? They'd played no part at all in the trial. Why not? Was the mother too stricken with grief? Was she alive, even? The father was alive, though, wasn't he? The insurance man. Morse brought his mind back to the central point he was seeking to establish before his imagined jury. No court would have accepted such unilateral identification without something to support it. And there had been something. Morse looked back to the actual words. Corroboration was afforded by the shoes later found in the forecabin of the Barbara Bray, which matched in the minutest degrees the contours of the dead woman's feet. So 1, the shoes in the cabin belonged to Joanna Franks. 2, the shoes had been worn by the drowned woman, therefore the drowned woman was Joanna Franks. QED. Even Aristotle might have been satisfied by such a syllogism. But what if the shoes had not belonged to Joanna? Then the inexorable conclusion must be that whatever was found floating face downwards at Duke's Cut in 1859, it was not the body of Joanna Franks. "Just one moment, Morse." The voice of the prosecution was deafening against his ear. "All right, the identification as it stands may appear a trifle tenuous, but have you any reason for discrediting such identification?" And the answering voice in Morse's brain was firm and confident. "Indeed, and if it should please my learned friends, I shall now proceed to tell you exactly what did happen between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. on the morning of Wednesday, the 21st of June, in 1859. Standing by the door to the forecabin, she could see them both, asleep, the pair of them, Oldfield and Musson, only the slight rise and fall of the faded maroon eiderdown that covered them betraying their fitful breathing. Drunk? Yes, very drunk, but Joanna herself had seen to that. Little or no persuasion required, but the timing important. She smiled grimly to herself, and consulted the little silver timepiece she always kept about her person. The watch her father had given her on her 22nd birthday, when some fees had been forthcoming from the London Patent Office. Her hand closed round the precious watch as if it were a talisman for the success of the imminent enterprise. Occasionally she spoke, very quietly, to the shifty, spotty-faced youth who stood beside her, his left hand upon the Z-shaped tiller, his right hand, where she had placed it herself, fondling the bosom of her dress. 25 yards ahead, the horse was plodding along the silent towpath as the Barbara Bray headed ever southward into the night. "Over a bit more, Tom," she whispered, as the boat moved into the elbow bend at Thrupp. She stepped up onto the side, while Wootton gently manoeuvred the boat in towards the right-hand bank. Wootton would not be celebrating his 15th birthday until February, but already in several ways he was a good deal older than his years. Not in every way, though. Never before Joanna had come on board had he felt so besotted with a woman as he was with her, exactly as the rest of the crew had been. There was something compelling about Joanna Franks, something about the way she flashed her eyes when she spoke, something wickedly controlled about her as she'd drunk her full share of liquor. And Oldfield had taken possession of her, of that Wootton was quite sure. Taken her in one of the pitch-black transit tunnels, when he had gladly taken Oldfield's sixpence and legged the Barbara Bray slowly towards that pinpoint of light, as darkly he'd listened to the noises of the love-making taking place in the bunk below. Towns, too, had taken Oldfield's sixpence in a tunnel further south, and both Towns and Musson, the lanky, lecherous-eyed Musson, knew only too well what was going on, soon wanting a share of things for themselves. No surprise, then, that Towns had gone for Musson with a knife. As agreed, Thomas Wootton provided her with the lantern. She stepped lightly off the Barbara Bray, a bonnet around her head, her shoes on her feet, onto the towpath. It was not unusual, of course, for women passengers to jump ashore at fairly regular intervals from a narrow boat. Female toiletry demanded a greater measure of decorum than did that for men. But Joanna might be gone a little longer than was usual that night. So she'd said. She stood watching the boat melt deeper and deeper into the night. Then, gauging she was out of earshot of the crew, she called out the man's name. Then again, then a third time, until she heard a rustling movement in the bushes beside her. Shh! The night air was very still, and her voice had carried clearly down the canal. But hearing nothing further, neither the youth at the helm nor the man with the stoical horse gave the matter much further thought. But one of the men supposedly asleep had heard it too. Meanwhile, Joanna and her accomplice had flitted stealthily along the row of small grey stone terraced cottages which lined the canal at Thrupp, keeping to the shadows, then along the short lane that led to the highway. "Everything ready?" He nodded briskly. "Don't talk now." They walked to a covered carrier's wagon which stood, a piebald horse between its shafts, tethered to a beech tree beside the verge. The moon appeared fitfully from behind the slow-moving cloud. "Knife?" he asked. "I sharpened it." She took off her cloak and handed it to him, taking in return the one he passed to her, similar to her own, though cheaper in both cloth and cut. She's in there?" Joanna half turned to the wagon for the first time, her voice sounding nervous. He jerked his head once, his small eyes bright in the heavily bearded face. "I don't want to see her." "No need." He had taken the lantern, and when the two of them climbed up to the front of the wagon, he shone it on a hand-drawn map, his right forefinger pointing to a bridge over the canal, some 400 yards north of Duke's Cut Lock. "We go down to here. You catch up with them, all right? Get on board again. Then after you get through the lock, you—" "What we agreed." "Yes, jump in, stay in the water as long as you like, but be sure no one sees you getting out. The wagon will be next to the bridge. Get in and lie still. I'll be there as soon as I've—" Joanna took the knife from her skirt. "Do you want me to do it?" "No." He took the knife quickly. "No?" "It's just that her face, well, it's gone black. I thought dead people usually went white." The man disappeared briefly into the darkness of the covered wagon, where he lifted the dead woman's skirts and made an incision of about 5 or 6 inches down the front of her calico knickers. The man was handing Joanna 2 bottles of dark-looking running horse ale, when he felt the firm grip of her hand on his shoulder, shaking, shaking, shaking. "Some soup for you, Mr. Morse?" It was Violet. not the soup. The report was a regular meeting of hospital and medical staff to appraise the patients in the ward and to discuss convalescences, relapses, prognoses, medications, and associated problems. The 1 p.m. meeting that day, Sunday, was well attended. The senior consultant, a junior houseman, Sister McLean, Charge Nurse Stanton, and 2 student nurses. Morse, it appeared, was no longer much of a problem. "He's making fairly good progress," Sister said. "Some of us," confided the consultant, "would like to persuade these dedicated drinkers that water is a wonderful thing." "He doesn't drink that much, does he?" suggested the houseman, his eyes skimming Morse's notes. "Nonsense, bloody liar, isn't he? He's on the mend, though. He's bloody lucky. I was thinking about cutting half his innards away." "He must be a fundamentally strong sort of man," said Sister. "I suppose so," conceded the consultant. "Apart from his stomach, his lungs, his kidneys, his liver, especially his liver. He might last till he's 60 if he does what we tell him, which I doubt." "Keep him another few days, do you think?" No, send him home. His wife will probably do just as good a job as we can." Eileen Stanton was about to correct the consultant on his factual error when a nurse burst into the office. "I'm sorry, Sister, but there's a cardiac arrest, I think, in one of the immunity beds." "Did he die?" asked Morse. Eileen, who had come to sit on his bed, nodded sadly. It was mid-afternoon. "How old was he?" "A few years younger than you, I should think." Her face was glum. "Perhaps if—" "You look as if you could do with a bit of tender loving care yourself," said Morse, reading her thought. "Yes." She looked at him and smiled. "And you, my good sir, are not going to get much more of our wonderful loving care. We're kicking you out tomorrow. Had quite enough of you." "I'm going out?" Morse wasn't sure if it was good news or bad, but she told him, "Good news, isn't it?" "I shall miss you." "Yes, and so shall I." Getting to her feet, she said no more, and Morse, with a little wistfulness, watched her walk away. For Morse, the news that he was to be discharged was simultaneously wonderful and woeful. Music awaited him. Wotan's Farewell from Die Valkyrie. Pavarotti in one of the Puccinis. Books, too. He trusted that the Neighbourhood Watch had done its duty, and that his first edition of A Shropshire Lad was still in its place on his shelves. Yes, it would be good to get home again, to please himself about what he listened to, or read, or ate, or drank. Well, within reason. Yet he would miss the hospital. Miss the nurses, miss the fellow patients, miss the routine, miss the visitors. But the departure from Ward 7C was not, for Morse, to be a memorable experience. When the message came to join a group of people who were being ambulanced to North Oxford, he had little opportunity of saying farewell to his ward mates. Waggy was in the washroom, another was fast asleep, one had just been taken to the X-ray department. The Ethiopian torchbearer was sitting in his bed reading The Blue Ticket. As for the nurses, most were bustling about their duties, and Morse realised that he was just another patient. Eileen he had not expected to see again, but neither was Sister McLean anywhere to be seen, as he was wheeled out by a cheerful porter with a crew cut and earrings. The fair Fiona, though, he did see. She waved and mouthed good luck as Morse waited for the service lift to arrive at level 7. Although Mrs. Green had kept Morse's partial central heating partially on, the flat seemed cold and unwelcoming. Lewis had not been in to clear up the stuff stuck through the letterbox, and Morse picked up 2 white-enveloped Christmas cards, one from his insurance company, with the facsimiled signature of the managing director, and his 2 Sunday papers, which reflected the conflict in Morse's mind between the cultured and the coarse. As usual, he first flicked through the pages of the full-breasted photographs and features on Hollywood intrigues. Then he made himself a cup of instant coffee, before settling down to read about the most recent fluctuations on the world's stock markets. At 5:30 the phone rang, and Morse knew that if he had one wish only, it could be for the caller to be Christine. The caller was Christine. Not only had she located Samuel Carter's rare book, but she'd read through the short chapter given over to Walter Towns. "That's wonderful," said Morse. "Where are you ringing from?" From home. Perhaps... Look, I've made a photocopy. Would you like me to send it?" "Could you read it quickly over the phone? It's fairly short, you say." Look, I'll ring you back, then we can talk as long as we like. I'm not that hard up, you know. All right, fire away. It begins on page 187. Ready? Ready, miss. Of the persons encountered in Perth in these last months was a man called Walter Towns, a local celebrity. He was a free man after serving his 15 years' penal servitude in the Long Bay Penitentiary. But he was a broken, witless man. He was but 47, but old before his time. He was small, only some 5 feet in stature, thin, and his exceedingly sallow complexion had remained untouched by the rays of a sun that is powerful in this region, and his eyes spoke of a certain dolefulness, as if he were remembering things done long ago and things done ill. In truth, the situation pertaining to this man was fully as melodramatic as my readers could have wished, for he had been reprieved from the gallows with only minutes to spare. It was with the utmost curiosity, therefore, that I questioned him. A woman had been murdered near Oxford in 1860 on the local canal, and suspicion had centred on the crew of a narrowboat plying south towards London. The 4 members of the crew, including both Towns himself and a lad of some 14 years, had duly been arrested and brought to court. Whilst the youth had been acquitted, the 3 others had been convicted and incarcerated in the city jail awaiting public execution. It was here, 2 or 3 minutes following the final visit of the chaplain to the condemned cell, that Towns had received the news of his reprieve. Yet my conversation with Towns proved a matter of some disappointment. He had experienced the ineffable agonies of a man faced with execution on the morrow. Yet whether he had slept little or not at all during the fateful final hours, Towns could not well remember, nor whether he had prayed for forgiveness and deliverance. Surprisingly, it had not been the hanging itself which had been the focal point of Towns' tortured thoughts that night. Rather, it had been the knowledge of the public interest aroused in the case, the notoriety, the infamy, the abomination. Of the crime itself, Towns protested his complete innocence, and his recollection of the canal journey, and especially of the victim herself, Joanna Franks, was most vivid. The woman had been in Towns' eyes quite wondrously attractive, and it may cause no surprise that she became almost immediately the object of the men's craving, and the cause of open jealousies. Indeed, Towns recalled an occasion when 2 of the crew, the 2 who were eventually hanged, had come to blows over that provocative woman, and one of them with a knife. Even the young boy, Harold Wootton, had come under her spell, and the older woman had, without much doubt, taken advantage of his infatuation. At the same time, from what Towns asserted, and from the manner of his assertion, I am of the view that he himself did not have sexual dealings with her. There is one interesting addendum to be made. In the first indictment, the charge of either rape or theft would possibly have been prosecuted with more success than that of murder, yet it was to be the charge of murder that was brought in the second trial. In similar instances, we may observe that the minor charge will frequently be suppressed when the major charge appears the more likely to be sustained. Was this, then, the reason why Towns seemed comparatively loquacious about the suggestion of theft? I know not. But it was his belief that Wootton had rather more interest in theft than in rape. After all, the availability of sexual dealings in 1860 was hardly a rarity along the English canals. "Well, that's it," Christine said. I'll put it in the post tonight." "Can't you bring it round?" "Life's, well, it's just a bit hectic at the minute," she replied, after an awkward silence. Morse needed no further excuses. "All right. You see, I'm living with someone." Morse said nothing. "Is your address the same as in the directory? E. Morse?" "That's me." "What does the E stand for?" "Just call me Morse." Morse thought of her for many minutes after he'd cradled the phone. Then he recalled the testimony of Samuel Carter, and marvelled that a researcher of his undoubted experience could make so many factual errors. The date of the murder, Towns' age, Wootton's Christian name. Very interesting, though. Why, Morse had even guessed right about that dust-up with the knife. Well, almost right. He'd got the wrong man, but... 10 minutes later the phone rang again, and Morse knew in his bones that it was Christine Greenaway. It was Strange, his superintendent. "You're out then, Morse, good. You've had a bit of a rough ride." "On the mend now, sir. Kind of you to ring." No great rush, about getting back, I mean. We're a bit understaffed at the minute, but give yourself a few days to get over things. Delicate thing, the stomach, Why don't you try to get away for a couple of days? Thank you, sir. By the way, they've signed me off for a fortnight. A fortnight? It's a delicate thing, the stomach, sir. Yes, well, I'll be back as soon as I can, sir, and perhaps it wouldn't do me any harm to take your advice about getting away for a while. Do you a world of good. The wife's brother is just back from Ireland. Took the car, Fishguard Dunleary. Then the west coast, Kerry, Connemara. Marvellous, he said. It had been kind of strange to ring, and as he sat in his armchair, Morse reached idly for the World Atlas from his large bookshelf. Ireland was on page 10. Now, where was Kerry? Ah, yes, west of Tralee. He moved his finger up the coast to Galway Bay. Then he saw it. Burtnaboy Bay. And suddenly the thought of going over to Connemara seemed overwhelmingly attractive. By himself? Yes, it had to be by himself. It would have been good to have taken Christine, but... Suddenly Morse was conscious of the tingling excitement in the nape of his neck, and then in his shoulders. His eyes sparkled as if some inner current had been activated. He sat back in the armchair and smiled slowly to himself. What, he wondered, was the routine in the Irish Republic for exhumation? "You what?" asked a flabbergasted Lewis, who had called round at 7:30. He himself had made an interesting little discovery. Well, the WPC at St Aldate's had made it really, and he was hoping that it might amuse Morse. But to witness Morse galloping ahead of the hunt, chasing after some imaginary fox of his own, was, if not unusual, just a little disconcerting. "You see, Lewis," Morse was straight away in full swing, "this is one of the most beautiful little deceptions we've ever come across. The problems inherent in the case are resolved immediately once we take one further step into imaginative improbability." "You've lost me, sir." "No, I haven't. Just take one more step yourself. You think you're in the dark, right? But the dark is where we all are. The dark is where I was until I took one more step into the dark, and then I found myself in the sunshine." "Well, I'm very glad to hear it. It was the identification bit that worried me. But once we consider the psychology of the whole... Sir, could you please just tell me simply in... I'm boring you. Is that what you're saying?" "Exactly, sir." Morse nodded happily. "Let's put it simply then, all right? I read a story in hospital, I get interested. I think the wrong people got arrested and hanged for the murder of that little tart from Liverpool. And, as I say, you said you'd get to the point, sir." "Right. I'm thinking Joanna's father gets a job as an insurance rep. Like most people in that position, he gets a few of his own family, if they're daft enough to take out a policy with him, and he gets a bit of commission. Well, I think both Joanna and her first husband, our conjurer friend, were soon enlisted as policy holders. Then times get tough, and to crown all the misfortunes, Mr. Donovan, the greatest man in all the world, goes and dies. And when Joanna's natural grief has abated, she finds she's done very nicely, thank you, out of the insurance on his life. She receives £100 with profits on a policy taken out only 2 or 3 years previously. Now, £100 plus in 1850, whenever, was a very considerable sum of money, and Joanna perhaps began at that point to see the insurance business not only as a future benefit, but as an actual present source of profit. So, after Donovan's death, when she met and married Franks, one of the first things she insisted on was his taking out a policy, not on his life, but on hers. Her father could effect such a transaction without any trouble, although it was probably soon after this that the Notts and Midlands got a little suspicious about Daniel Carrick, Joanna's father, and told him his services were no longer... Sir... Morse held up his hand. Joanna Franks was never murdered, Lewis. She was the mastermind, mistress mind, behind a deception that was going to rake in some considerable and desperately needed profit. It was another woman, roughly the same age and same height, who was found in the Oxford Canal, a woman provided by Joanna's second husband, the ostler from the Edgware Road, who'd already made his journey from London to join his wife. You remember in the Colonel's book? Morse turned to the passage. Here it is. He explained how, in consequence of some information, he had come into Oxfordshire. Bloody liar. Lewis, interested now despite himself, nodded. "So, what you're saying, sir, is that Joanna worked this insurance fiddle and probably made quite a nice little packet for herself and for her father as well?" "Yes, but not only that. Listen, I may just be wrong, Lewis, but I think that not only was Joanna wrongly identified as the lawful wife of Charles Franks by Charles Franks, but that Charles Franks was the only husband of the woman supposedly murdered on the Barbara Bray. In short, Charles Franks was Donovan." "Phew. He was a man of many parts, Lewis. He was a conjurer, an impersonator, a swindler, a cunning schemer, and a callous murderer. He was a loving husband, a tearful witness, and the first and only husband of Joanna Franks, F.T. Donovan. We all thought there were 3 principal characters in our little drama. Now I'm telling you that we've only got 2. Joanna and the man buried out on the west coast of Ireland." Lewis was silent. How else? He had a precious little piece of evidence in his pocket. But while Morse's mind was still coursing through the upper atmosphere, there was little point in interrupting for the minute. He put the envelope containing the single photocopied sheet on the coffee table and listened further. "In the account of Joanna's last few days, we've got some evidence that she could have been a bit deranged. At some point, they said, she kept calling out her husband's name. Franks, Franks, Franks. Agreed? But she wasn't calling that at all. She was calling her first husband, Lewis. Hefty Donovan. F.T. Donovan. I'll put my next month's salary on that F standing for Frank. Who's ever heard of a wife calling her husband by his surname?" "Well, I have, sir." "Nonsense, not these days." "But it's not these days. She was calling Frank Donovan, believe me." "But she could have been queer in the head." "Nonsense." "Well, we shan't ever know for sure, shall we, sir?" "Nonsense." Morse sat back with the self-satisfied air of a man who believes that what he has called nonsense 3 times must, by the laws of the universe, be necessarily untrue. If only we knew how tall they were, Joanna and whoever the other woman was. But there is just a chance, isn't there? The cemetery, Lewis. Which do you want first, sir, the good news or the bad news? Morse frowned. "That's," pointing to the envelope, "that's the good news." Slowly, Morse withdrew and studied the photocopied sheet and read, 25 minutes past 7 o'clock. Drowned body was in cut, taken to Plough Inn at Wolve. Identity? Unknown. Prelim findings would suggest death by drowning. No obvious injury was seen. 5 3¾ inches, well nourished, circa 35 years. Bruise on mouth, right side. Body warm, full clothes, not bonnet and shoes. Face discoloured, black. Not the coroner's report, sir, but the next best thing. This Dr. Willis must have seen her before the post-mortem. Interesting, isn't it? Very interesting. The report was set out on an unruled sheet of paper and was clearly the notes of an orderly-minded local doctor called upon to certify death. The writing was typical of the medical profession in its semi-legibility, beset by a confusion between the M's, W's, N's and U's. Yet there were 1 or 2 real nuggets of gold here. The good Willis had made an exact measurement of height, and had written 1 or 2 most pertinent observations. Sad from Morse's point of view, however, was the unequivocal assertion that the body was still warm. It must have been this document which had been incorporated into the post-mortem findings, and duly reiterated in court. And it was a pity. For if Morse had been correct in believing that another body had been substituted for Joanna Franks, that woman must surely have been killed in the early hours of the morning, and could not, therefore, have been drowned some 3 or 4 hours later. Far too risky. It was odd, certainly, that the dead woman's face had turned black so quickly. But there was no escaping the fact that the first medical man who had examined the corpse had found it still warm. Is that what the report had said, though? Still warm? No. No, it hadn't. It just said warm. Or did it? Carefully, Morse looked again at the report and sensed a familiar tingling around his shoulders. Could it be? Had everyone else read the report wrongly? In every case, the various notes were separated from each other by some form of punctuation, either dashes, 8 of them, or full stops, 4, or question marks, only 1. All the notes except 1, the exception being that body warm, full clothes. There was neither a dash nor a stop between these two clearly disparate items. The solution was simple. There'd been no break requiring any punctuation. Morse looked again at the line. Willis seemed particularly fond of the word was, so the line should certainly read, body was in full clothes. Not warm. In fact, suddenly the body was very, very cold. Lewis, while fully accepting the probability of the alternative reading, did not appear to share Morse's excitement. It was time for the bad news. No chance of checking this out in the Summertown graveyard, sir. Why not? The gravestones are still there. They were all removed when they built the flats there. What, even those the Colonel mentioned? Lewis nodded. And Morse knew full well that any chance of getting an exhumation order to dig up a retirement home garden was extremely remote. Yet the thought that he might have clinched his theory. He knew that it was of no great matter to anyone except himself, but he found himself irked that there was no chance of knowing now, not for certain. And if the meticulous Dr. Willis had been correct in his measurements, she couldn't have been Joanna, surely. After Lewis had gone, Morse made a phone call. Max, what was the average height of women in the 19th century? Which end of the 19th century? Well, let's say the middle. Interesting question. Well, it varied, I suppose. Come on. Poor food, lack of protein, all that stuff, not very big, most of them. Certainly no bigger than the Rippers victims in the 1880s. 4'9", 4'10", 4'11", that sort of height, those ladies were. Except one. Wasn't her name Stride? Yes, Liz Stride. They called her Long Liz, so much taller than the other women. Well, how tall was Long Liz? Don't know. Can you find out? What, now? And ring me back? Bloody hell. Thanks. Morse was 3 minutes into the love duet from Act 1 of Die Valkyrie when the phone rang. 5'3". Morse whistled. Thanks, Max. By the way, are you at the lab tomorrow? Something I want to show you. So the petite little figure had measured 3/4 of an inch more than Long Liz Stride, and her shoes, as Lewis had ascertained, were size 5. Well, well, well. The communication from the insurance company had been a final demand for his previous month's premium, and the first thing Morse did the following morning was to write out a cheque with a brief letter of apology. He understood very little about money, but a dozen or so years previously he had deemed it prudential even, to pay a monthly premium of £55 against a lump sum of 12,000 with profits at 60, an age looming ever closer. He had never given a thought about what would happen if he predeceased his policy. He ought, perhaps, to think of making a will. Coincidentally, he had been talking to Lewis about insurances the day before, and, he admitted to himself, largely making it up as he went along. But it was far from improbable, wasn't it, what he'd guessed? An insurance fiddle? He looked out the first material that Christine had brought him, and studied again the facts and figures of the Nottinghamshire and Midlands Friendly Society for 1859. Joanna had been born in 1821, so in 1859 she was 38. If she'd taken out a policy a year, 2 years earlier, that would be an annual premium of £3, 8 shillings and 9pence, under £7, say, for a return of 100. Not bad at all. And if Donovan had already pocketed a similar packet... Morse left his flat in mid-morning, the first excursion since his return, to post his letter. He met no one he knew as he turned right off the Banbury Road, heading towards Middle Way. It was a dark, dankish morning, and a scattering of rooks squawked away in the trees. He walked past Dudley Court, the block of flats built on the site of the old parish cemetery, where a Christmas tree bedecked with red, green and yellow bulbs was already switched on. Past the Conservative Association premises, in which he had never and would never set foot, past the Spiritualist Church and the Women's Institute HQ, until finally he came into South Parade, just opposite the post office. But as he walked by the familiar landmarks, his mind was far away, and the decision firmly taken. If he was to be cheated of finding one of his suspects, he would go and look for the other. He needed a break. He would have a break. There was a travel agency immediately across the street, and the girl at the desk smiled brightly. "Can I help you, sir?" Yes, I'd like to book a holiday with a car in Ireland, the Republic, that is. Later that day, Morse called at the William Dunn School of Pathology. "Have a look at these for me, will you?" Refraining from comment, Max looked dubiously at him over his half-lenses. "Max, all I want to know is whether they come from M&S or Littlewoods." "The tear, Max, the tear." "Tear? What tear?" Max picked up the knickers with some distaste and examined them. "No tear here, Morse, not the faintest sign. Calico, isn't it?" "I think so." "Well, we don't need a microscope to tell us it's a cut. A neat, clean, straightforward cut. All right?" "With a knife?" "What the hell else do you cut things with?" "Cheese slicer? Paris? What a wonderful thing, Morse, is the human imagination." Inspector Mulvaney spotted him parking the car in the visitor's space. When the little station had been converted 10 years earlier from a single detached house into Kilkinnan's Crime Prevention HQ, the Garda had deemed it appropriate that the four-man squad should be headed by an inspector. It seemed, in retrospect, something of an overreaction. With its 1,000 or so inhabitants, Kilkiernan regularly saw its ration of fisticuffs outside one or more of the 14 public houses, but as yet the little community had steered clear of international smuggling or industrial espionage. Here even road accidents were a rarity, though this was attributable more to the scarcity of cars than to the sobriety of their drivers. The man parking his Lancia Mulvaney knew to be the English policeman who had rung through to ask for help in locating a cemetery, and who thought it was probably the one overlooking Burtnaboy Bay, that being the only burial ground marked on the map. Mulvaney had been able to assure Chief Inspector Morse that indeed it would be the cemetery on the side of the hill. The local dead were always buried there being no alternative accommodation. And when Morse explained his unlikely, ridiculous, selfish mission, Mulvaney warmed to him immediately. No chance, of course, of any exhumation order being granted, but perhaps Morse might be interested in hearing about the business of grave digging in the Republic. A man could never dig a grave on a Monday, for reasons which he'd forgotten, and in any case it wasn't Monday, was it? And if a grave was dug, even on a Monday, it had always, sir, to be in the morning, or at least the previous evening, and it was always the custom for the chief mourner to supply a little quantity of whisky at the graveside for the saddened family, and for the grave diggers too, of course, who had shovelled up the clinging, cloggy soil. For sure 'tis always a thirsty business, sir, the working of the soil. So Morse, the chief mourner, walked out into the main street and purchased 3 bottles of Irish malt. An understanding had been arrived at. In his mind's eye, Morse had envisaged a bank of arc lights illuminating a well-marked grave, with barricades erected, a posse of constables to keep the public from prying, and press photographers training their telescopic lenses on the site. The time? That would be 5:30 a.m., the usual exhumation hour. It was not to be. Together, Morse and Mulvaney had fairly easily located the final habitation of the greatest man in all the world, among the 300 or 400 graves within the walled area of the hillside cemetery. Donovan's stone was a poor, mossed and lichened thing, no more than 2 feet high. So weather-beaten was the stone that only the general outlines of the lettering could be followed, but it looked as if his name had been Frank. "That's him," said Morse triumphantly. "God rest his soul," added Mulvaney. "That's if it's there, of course." Morse grinned. "How are you going to explain—" "We're digging yet another grave, sir, in the daylight, just as normal." It was all quite quick. Mulvaney had appointed 2 men to dig, and after getting down only 2 or 3 feet, one of the spades struck what sounded like a wooden coffin. Once all the dark earth had been removed, Morse and Mulvaney looked down to a plain coffin top with no plate of any sort screwed into it. The wood, 1-inch boarding, looked badly warped, but in a reasonable state. Morse, however, betraying once again his horror of corpses, quietly declined the honour of removing the lid. So it was Mulvaney himself, awkwardly straddling the hole, who bent down and pulled at the top of the coffin, which gave way easily, the metal screws clearly having disintegrated long ago. As the boards slowly lifted, they saw that a whitish mould hung down from the inside of the coffin lid, and in the coffin itself, covering the body, A shroud of some sort was overspread with the same creeping white fungus. But what body? The coffin contained no body at all. What it did contain was a roll of greenish carpet about 5 feet in length, folded round a dozen squares of peat. Of Donovan there was no trace whatsoever. During the days following his return from Ireland, Morse grew somewhat fitter, and very soon, in his own judgment at least, he had managed to regain some semblance of health. Morse asked no more. He'd recently bought himself one of the old Furtwängler recordings of The Ring, and during the hours of Elysian enjoyment which the performance was giving him, the case of the towpath mystery assumed a slowly diminishing significance. The whole thing had brought him some recreative enjoyment, but now it was finished. There was apparently nothing further he could do. Christmas was coming up fast now, and he was glad not to have any tiring traipsing around the shops. He received 6 cards, 2 invitations to drinks evenings, and a communication from the hospital. Xmas party. The nursing staff of the John Radcliffe Hospital request the pleasure of your company on the evening of Friday the 22nd of December, from 8 p.m. until midnight, at the Nurses' Hostel, Headington Hill. Disco dancing, ravishing refreshments, fabulous fun. Please come, dress informal. The printed card was signed in blue biro, Ward 7C, and followed by a single X. It was on Friday the 15th, a week before the scheduled party, that Morse's eye caught the name in the Oxford Times deaths column. Denniston, Marjorie, on December the 10th, peacefully at her home in Woodstock, aged 78 years. She wished her body to be given to medical research. Donations gratefully received in honour of the late Colonel W.M. Denniston by the British Legion Club, Lambourne. Morse thought back to the only time he'd met the quaint old girl, so proud as she'd been of her husband's work, a work which had brought him such disproportionate interest, a work which he'd not even had to pay for. He signed a cheque for £20 and stuck it in a cheap brown envelope. He used a second-class stamp. It wasn't a matter of life and death, after all. He looked up the British Legion's address in the telephone directory, and then turned to Denniston, W.M. There it was, 46 Church Walk, Woodstock. Had there been any family? It hardly appeared so from the obituary notice. So what happened to things if there was no one to leave them to? As with Mrs. Denniston, possibly? As with anyone childless or unmarried? He parked the Lancia 20 yards or so from the grey-stoned, terraced house in Church Walk. He knocked on the front door, and was admitted forthwith by a young man, a great-nephew of the old colonel, and the only surviving relative. Morse explained what his interest was, to discover whether the late colonel had left behind any notes or documents relating to murder on the Oxford Canal, and happily the answer was yes, albeit a very limited yes. In the study was a pile of typescript, and clipped to it one short letter, with no date, no sender's address, and no envelope. "Our dear Daniel," it said, "we do both trust you're keeping well these past months. We shall be in Derby in early September, when we hope we shall be with you. Please say to Mary how the dress she did was very successful, and will she go on with the other one, if she is feeling recovered. Yours truly and affectionately, Matthew." That was all. Enough, though, for the colonel to feel that it was worth preserving. There was only one Daniel in the case, Daniel Carrick from Derby. Morse turned over the faded, deeply creased letter, and saw on the back a few pencilled notes in the colonel's hand. No records from insurance company. Mrs. C. very poorly at the time. Not told of J's death. 12 Spring Street, still occupied, 12/4/76. There it was, then. A fingertip of contact with one of the players in that 19th century drama. But as for the 2 principal actors, where Joanna was buried, or where the greatest man in all the world, who knew? Or who could ever know? As soon as he took his first steps across the noisy, throbbing, flashing room at the nurse's hostel, Morse realized he had made a tragic error in accepting the invitation. Idiot! He sipped some warm, insipid punch that was handed out in white plastic cups to each new arrival. He had just decided that the best thing about it was the little cubes of apple floating on the top, when Fiona detached her sickly-looking bow from the dance floor and came up to him. "Happy Christmas!" Morse felt the dryness of her lips against his cheek, and then she was gone, throwing herself once more into a series of jerky contortions, like some epileptic puppet. Morse's plastic cup was empty, and he walked slowly past a long line of tables, where beneath the white coverings he glimpsed sugared mince pies and skewered sausages. "We'll be starting on them soon," said a familiar voice. He turned to find Eileen blessedly alone and wearing her uniform. "Hello," said Morse. "Hello. It's good to see you." She looked at him and nodded. Then from somewhere a tall man materialized. "This is Gordon," said Eileen. And when Morse had shaken hands with the man, he once more found himself alone, wondering how to make an inconspicuous exit. He was only a few feet from the main door, when she was suddenly standing in front of him. "You're not trying to sneak away, I hope?" "Hello, sister. No, I'm glad you came. I know you're a wee bit old for this sort of thing." Her Scottish accent seemed to be mocking him gently. Morse nodded. He looked down to pick out the one remaining apple cube from his cup. "Your sergeant did you rather better. With the drink, I mean." Morse looked at her suddenly, almost as if he had never looked at her before. Her skin, in this stroboscopic light, looked almost opaline. Her eyes were emerald, her auburn hair was swept upward, and her mouth was delicately lipsticked. "Would you like to dance?" It's not one of my things, dancing." "What?" But Morse was never to know what she was going to ask him. A young houseman, smiling, had grabbed her by the hand and was pulling her to the floor. "Come on, Sheila, our dance!" Sheila? Morse felt a stab of jealousy as his eyes followed them. The young man's body pressed close to hers. He placed his plastic cup on a table and left. At 9:30 the following morning, he rang the hospital and asked for Ward 7C. "Can I speak to Sister, please?" "Who's calling?" It's a personal call." "We can't take personal calls, I'm afraid. If you'd like to leave your name." "Just tell her one of her old patients." "Is it Sister McLean you wanted?" "Yes." "She's left. Officially she left last week, but she stayed on for a party last night. She's off to be Director of Nursing Services." "Where?" "Derby, the Royal Infirmary." "Just humour me, Lewis, that's all I ask." And Lewis had needed little persuasion, since fast driving was his only significant vice apart from egg and chips. He was delighted, albeit on one of his rest days, to be invited to drive the Lancia. The car was a powerful performer. The main object of the mission was to find out if a thoroughfare called Spring Street still stood, as it had stood until 1976, on the northern outskirts of Derby. And Spring Street proved difficult to locate, in spite of a city map purchased from a corner newsagent. Morse became progressively tetchier as the pedestrians to whom Lewis wound down his window appeared either totally ignorant or mutually contradictory. Finally, however, the Lancia homed in on an area marked off by hoardings, announcing itself as the Derby Development Complex. "Could be we're too late," said Lewis. Morse wound down his own window and spoke to a brick-dusted, white-helmeted workman. "Have you flattened Spring Street yet?" "Won't be long, mate." The man pointed vaguely towards a block of terraced houses. Morse, irked by the mate, wound up his window without a thank you, and Lewis pulled the Lancia in behind a builder's skip a couple of streets away. A young woman pushing a pram assured them that, yes, this was Spring Street, and the two men got out of the car. It seemed questionable whether any of the houses in this unlovely place had ever figured in the desirable category. Many were now semi-derelict, and several boarded up completely. With distaste, Morse eyed the squashed beer cans and discarded fish and chip wrappings that littered the narrow pavement. Then he walked slowly along, before stopping beside a house boarded up against squatters or vandals. Number 12. It stood on the corner. A wooden gate, hanging forlornly from one of its rusted hinges, led to a small backyard, choked with litter and brownish weeds. The dull red bricks of the walls were flaking badly, and the single window frame had been completely torn away, leaving the inside of the mean little abode open to the elements. Morse poked his face through the empty frame before turning away with a sickened disgust. In one corner of the erstwhile kitchen was what appeared to be a pile of excrement, and beside it half a loaf of white bread, its slices curled and mildew green. "Not a pretty sight," whispered Lewis. "She was brought up here," said Morse quietly. "She lived here with her mother and her father. And her brother." Yes, Morse had forgotten the brother. Joanna's younger brother, the boy named after his father. Forgotten him altogether. Morse left the small backyard and slowly walked round to the front again, where he stood in the middle of the deserted street and looked at the little terrace house, in which Joanna Donovan Franks had probably spent, the first 20 or so years of her life? 20 years in that poky little kitchen, competing for space with the copper, the mangle, and the cooking range, her parents and her younger brother. Morse had his own vivid recollections of a similarly tiny kitchen, in a house which, as he'd been told, had been demolished to make way for a carpet store. But he'd never been back. It was always a mistake to go back, because life went on perfectly well without you. It had been a mistake, for example, to go back to the hospital, as it would be a mistake to go along to the Derby Royal and announce nonchalantly to Nettie that he just happened to be passing through the city. Forget it, Morse. Lewis had been talking while these thoughts were crossing Morse's mind, and he hadn't heard a word. "Pardon, Lewis?" "I say, that's what we used to do, that's all. Over the top of the head and put the date against it." Morse, unable to construe such gobbledygook, nodded and led the way to the car. "Where to now, sir?" It took a bit of saying, but he said it. "Straight home, I think." Morse seldom engaged in any conversation in the car, and he was predictably silent as Lewis drove out towards the motorway. He was increasingly conscious of one little irritant. It always bothered him not to have heard even the smallest things. "What was it you were saying back there?" "You mean when you weren't listening?" "Just tell me, Lewis." "Well, it was when we were children, that's all. We used to measure how tall we were getting. Mum used to do it every birthday against the kitchen wall. That's what reminded me, really, looking in that kitchen. She used to put a ruler over the top of our heads and then a line and a date." Again, Morse was not listening. "Lewis, turn round, go back." Lewis looked at Morse with some puzzlement. "Lewis, just turn round." Morse's finger on the kitchen switch produced only an empty click, in spite of a bulb that hung shadeless from the disintegrating plaster boards. "Whereabouts did you used to measure things, Lewis?" "About here, sir." Lewis stood against the inner door of the kitchen, his back to the wall. He placed his left palm across the top of his head before turning round. His fingertips marked the height. 5'11", that is, unless I've shrunk a bit. The yellowing wallpaper appeared not to have been renovated for half a century or more. Morse tore down a strip, but marked memorials to Joanna there were none. The two men stood silent as the afternoon seemed to grow perceptibly colder and darker by the minute. "It was a thought, wasn't it?" said Morse. "But we're not going to stand here and strip all these walls. Wouldn't take long, would it? We'd know where to look." "We would? With only a little house. We'd just look between, say, 4 feet and 5 feet from the floor. Downstairs only." "Lewis, you're a genius. But about half an hour before it gets too dark." It was 20 minutes to 4 when Lewis called from a narrow hallway. "Something here, sir, and I think—" "Careful, careful," muttered Morse, coming nervously alongside. Gradually the paper was pulled away, and there, inscribed on the original plaster below 3 layers of papering, and still clearly visible, were 2 sets of black penciled lines. For several moments Morse stood in the darkened hallway and gazed upon the wall. "Get a torch, Lewis, and a tape measure." "Where?" "Anywhere. Everybody's got a torch, man. Telling me from the gas board there's a leak in number 12. The house isn't on gas. Get on with it, Lewis." When Lewis returned, Morse was still considering his wall marks, beaming as happily at the 8 lines on the right as a pool punter surveying a winning line of stored draws. Taking the torch, he played it over the evidence. It also showed a letter in between the 2 sets of measurements, slightly towards the right. The letter D. Daniel. the lines on the right must mark the height of Daniel Carrick, for those on the left were those of Joanna Franks. Are you thinking what I'm thinking, Lewis? I reckon so, sir. Joanna married in 1841 or 1842. That fits well because the measurement ended in 1841, finishing at the same height as she was in 1840, and her younger brother Daniel was gradually catching her up, about the same height in 1836, quite a few inches taller in 1841. Morse took the white tape measure and let it roll out to the floor. Then he held the end to the top of Joanna's measurements. Lewis swung the torch as he knelt on the dirty red tiles. The height measured only 4'9", and as Lewis knew, the woman who had been pulled out of Duke's cut had been 5'3 3/4, almost 7 inches taller. So you were right there. Beyond any reasonable doubt? Yes, I think so. Beyond all doubt. There'll always be that 1% of doubt about most things, I suppose. If we just found that one little extra thing, like a J on the wall here, or I don't know. But there's nothing else to find, sir. No, I'm sure there isn't, said Morse, but only after hesitating just a little. Together they sought out the site foreman. Producing his warrant card, Morse dictated his wishes, making the whole thing stand as if the authority of MI5 and MI6 lay behind his instructions. A series of photographs were to be taken as soon as possible of the pencil marks on the wall in the entrance hall at number 12 Spring Street, and yes, the site foreman thought he could see to it without too much trouble. In fact, he was a bit of a dab hand with the camera himself. Then, after Lewis had returned torch and tape measure to a slightly puzzled-looking householder, the afternoon events were over. It was 5 minutes to 6 when Lewis tried once again to drive away from Derby and make for the M1. At 6 o'clock, Morse leaned forward and turned on the car radio for the news, then suddenly switched it off again. Do you realize it's on opening time, Lewis? No such thing, me, sir. You know what I mean. Look, we've got something to celebrate. Pull in at the next pub and I'll buy you a pint. You will? Morse was not renowned for his generosity in treating his subordinates. Lewis smiled to himself. But I'm driving, sir. Quite right, Lewis. Don't want any trouble with the police. Lewis sat sipping his St. Clement's and listened to Morse conducting a lengthy conversation with the landlord about the wickedness of the lager brewers. Then, after draining his third pint with his wonted rapidity, Morse was apparently ready to depart. Is there a telephone? The landlord pointed the way. Just outside the gents. Lewis walked outside and stood waiting by the car until Morse reappeared. Lewis, I'd just like you to call round quickly to the hospital, if you will. The Derby Royal. Not too far out of the way, they tell me. But the stomach trouble again, sir. No? Well, I don't think you should have had all that beer, though. Are you going to drive me there or not, Lewis? Morse insisted that Lewis park the Lancia in the ambulance's only area outside the main entrance. How long will it be, sir? Not sure, Lewis. It's my lucky day, though, so maybe a little while. It was half an hour later that Morse emerged. All right, then, sir? Well, look, Lewis, I've decided to stay overnight. I think I'd like to be there when you take those photographs, you know? Well, I can't stay, sir. I'm on duty tomorrow. I know, I'm not asking you to, am I? I'll get the train back, no problem. You sure, sir? Quite sure. You don't mind, do you, Lewis? Lewis shook his head. Can I take you to a hotel or something? No need to bother, I'll find something. You look as though you've already found something, sir. Do I? As the Lancia accelerated along the M1, Lewis was still smiling quietly to himself, recalling the look on Morse's face as he walked once more towards the automatic doors. On the morning of Friday the 11th of January, Morse caught the early Cathedrals Express to Paddington. He was programmed to speak on Inner City Prime at 11 at the Hendon Symposium. He bought the Times and the Oxford Times at the bookstall, got a seat at the rear of the train, and had solved the Times crossword by duplicate. He read the letters and obituaries, then, reading, turned to the Oxford Times crossword. The letter was Quixote, and Morse smiled to himself as he remembered Waggy Greenaway finally solving the same set as Bradman's famous duck, fix, and writing in Donald. Nothing quite so amusing here, but a nice puzzle. 12 minutes to complete, not bad. As the train sped through Maidenhead, he took a sheet of paper from his briefcase and looked through the list of those who would be attending the conference. Nobody knew in the A to B range, but then he scanned the E to F. Eagleston, Ellis, Emmett, Erskine, Farmer, Favant, Fielding. He stopped and looked again at the F's. Favant. The name was vaguely familiar, yet he couldn't remember where. Unusual name, huh? And then he remembered. Yes, Favant was the name of the man who'd been walking along the Oxford Canal at the time Joanna Franks was murdered. Was supposedly murdered. The man had been traced to the man's head, where he signed the register. A Muslim man. Maybe not his real name at all, for the canal had been full of men who used an alias. In fact, he recollected 2 of the crew of the Barbara Bray itself had done so. Alfred Mutton, alias Alfred Brotherton, Walter Pound, alias Walter Fold. It might well be of some deep psychological significance that criminals sometimes seem most unwilling to give up their name totally. Morse had known it quite often. It was as if a man's name were almost an intrinsic part of him, but he could never show it completely, as if it were as much part of his personality as his skin. Musson had kept his Christian name, hadn't he? So had Pounds. Morse spent the rest of the journey looking idly out of the window, his brain tidying up a few scattered thoughts. Donald Bradman. Don Bradman, the name by which everyone recognised the greatest batsman ever. And F.T. Donman, the greatest man in all the world, and... Ye gods! Blood was running cold through Morse's limbs, as he remembered the man who had identified the body of Joanna Franks. The man who had been physically incapable of looking into the faces of the prisoners. The man who had held his hand to his face as he wept, and turned his back on the men arraigned before the court. Why Morse? Because the boatman might have recognised him, for they had seen him, albeit fleetingly in the dawn, as he made to go further on his way with all speed. Donald Favant, or Don Favant. Morse wrote out the letter D-O-N-F-A-V-A-N-T along the bottom margin of the Times, and then below them, the name of which they